Bramwell Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of Juniper and Stem like he owned it, which was precisely the point, and dropped a leather folder onto the wooden counter with a crack that made Evelyn Hartwell flinch behind her work table. Inside the folder were loan documents, her loan documents, stamped with a red overdue notice so fresh the ink still smelled sharp. 3 months, Voss said, straightening his coat lapels with the satisfied patience of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. You've got 3 months before the bank calls the note, and we both know you can't cover it. He smiled at her the way a man smiles when he's holding all the cards. Unless you're ready to have a real conversation about your future. Evelyn did not move. Voss leaned forward. Distance yourself from Silas Boone. Come work with me. And all of this, he tapped the folder, disappears. If you've ever watched someone you care about be cornered like an animal, you know exactly what happens next. And if you want to find out whether Evelyn Hartwell folds or fights, you'll want to stay until the very end of this story. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand that moment in the flower shop, you need to understand the man who started it all. Red Willow, Wyoming was the kind of town that remembered everything and forgave almost nothing. It had one main street, one sheriff, 2 saloons, and exactly the right number of opinions about everybody else's business. The wind came down from the mountains with a particular cruelty in February, scraping ice across the storefronts and rattling the painted signs until the hinges gave out. Most people learned to move fast through it. Get where you're going. Don't linger. Silas Boone lingered. He always came on Fridays, and he always came at 3, and by the time he pushed through the door of Juniper and Stem, the afternoon light had gone flat and pale against the front windows. He wore the same coat most weeks, a dark canvas duster that had been mended along the left shoulder at least twice. And he carried himself like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible, not from timidity, something else, something quieter and harder to name. Evelyn Hartwell had noticed him on his 3rd visit, not in the way the other men in town wanted to be noticed, which was the whole problem. She'd noticed him the way you notice a fence post that doesn't belong to the fence line, something slightly out of place that you can't stop measuring with your eye. He always bought the same thing. Wildflowers, when she had them. When she didn't, whatever was closest to wild. Prairie coneflowers, chicory, whatever yarrow had survived the week's cold snap. He never asked for ribbon. He never asked for wrapping. He just stood at the counter with his hat in his hands and pointed at whatever she'd put in the flat bucket near the door, and she'd tie them with the plain brown twine she kept on the hook, and he'd pay without haggling and leave. 3 years of Fridays. She'd counted, eventually. Not on purpose. It had just become the kind of thing you know without deciding to know it. His name she'd learned from Dottie Marsh, who ran the post office next door and had an opinion about everything that happened within 3 blocks of Main Street. That's Silas Boone, Dottie had said, watching him walk away down the boardwalk one afternoon. Black Ridge Ranch, been out there alone since. She'd made a small sound that wasn't quite a word and gone back inside. Since was apparently enough. People in Red Willow were fluent in since. Evelyn had eventually extracted the fuller version from her neighbor Mrs. Pell, who was less discreet and more sympathetic. Silas Boone had married a woman named Maeve 8 years ago. A quiet woman, people said. Pretty in an understated way. With dark hair she always kept pinned back and a habit of singing to herself while she worked in the garden. They'd had a daughter, June, named for the month they were married, but the winter 5 years back had been savage even by Wyoming standards, and a fever had come through Black Ridge when the passes were snowed shut and the doctor couldn't reach them, and Maeve and the baby had both been gone before the thaw. He blamed himself, Mrs. Pell had said, stirring her coffee. He still does. Evelyn had not asked any more questions after that. What she had done, instead, was start watching. Not in a way she was proud of, exactly. It was more like she couldn't stop. The way he came in with snow still on his hat brim. The way he looked at the flowers without any sense of urgency, like a man in no particular hurry to get anywhere. The way he was never rude and never warm and never anything that gave her much to work with. He thanked her every time. He looked at her exactly as long as the transaction required and then looked away again. It should have been nothing. It felt like something. She hadn't figured out why yet. What she did know was that she was 26 years old and running a flower shop that was slowly drowning in debt, and she didn't have the luxury of spending mental energy on a rancher who came in once a week and said approximately 12 words. She had a ledger that was telling her very unpleasant things. She had a window that needed recaulking before the next cold front. She had seed orders to place and invoices to file, and a competitor 2 towns over who had started advertising in the Red Willow Gazette with prices that made her stomach hurt. And she had, if she was being completely honest with herself, exactly one reliable source of income that walked through her door every Friday at 3 o'clock. So she noticed Silas Boone, and she didn't ask him anything. And the weeks continued to move the way weeks do in small towns, slowly enough to feel the weight of each one, but fast enough that suddenly it was March and she'd been watching him buy wildflowers for 3 years without ever once asking the single question that should have been obvious from the beginning. Who are they for? It wasn't her business. She knew that. Flowers were purchased for all kinds of reasons, and a florist who interrogated her customers about their grief would not be in business long. She wrapped them, she took the money, she said thank you. That was the arrangement. It had worked fine. Except it was the Friday before Easter, and she'd had a brutal week. A wholesale shipment had arrived half dead from frost damage. 2 wedding orders had canceled with almost no notice, and Bramwell Voss had been by twice to make the kind of suggestions that always sounded like business propositions but landed like something else entirely. And she was at the counter with a headache sitting right behind her left eye, and Silas Boone walked in at 3, and she was tying his wildflowers with the twine before she even thought about what she was doing, and then she said it. Who are they for? She heard it come out of her own mouth and felt a small lurch of alarm. Too direct, too personal. 3 years and not a word, and now Silas stopped. Not like a man startled. More like a man who had just walked into a room he didn't know was there. He stood at the counter with the wildflowers in one hand and his hat in the other, and for a full 3 seconds he didn't say anything at all. Evelyn started to take it back. She opened her mouth, the apology already forming. "My wife," he said, "and my daughter." His voice was level, not flat. There's a difference, though it takes a while to learn it. Flat is empty. Level is what you do when you're carrying something heavy and you're trying very hard not to drop it. "June," he said. She was 9 months old. Evelyn put the twine down on the counter. She didn't know she was going to say the next part until she'd already said it. "How long have you been bringing flowers?" 5 years. He looked at the bouquet in his hand. Maeve liked Fridays. She said it was the only day that felt like permission to rest. She'd pick whatever was blooming and put it in a jar on the kitchen table. He paused. She always said flowers in a house meant someone was paying attention. The headache behind Evelyn's left eye had stopped mattering. What did she like best? She asked. In terms of flowers. Silas looked up, and for the first time in 3 years of Fridays, he looked at her like she was a person asking a question rather than a counter attached to a commerce transaction. "Lavender," he said after a moment. She said it smelled like something that hadn't been ruined yet. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She just tucked a small stem of lavender into the bottom of his bouquet beneath the yarrow and pushed it across the counter toward him. He stood there looking at it for a moment longer than made sense. "Thank you," he said. And he left. She stood at the counter after he was gone, listening to the bell above the door settle into silence, and thought about a woman she'd never met who thought lavender smelled like something that hadn't been ruined yet. And she thought about the kind of grief that makes a man drive into town every Friday for 5 years just to keep a habit that someone else started. She was still thinking about it the following Friday when he came back. He stopped when he saw the lavender she'd already added to the bundle she'd set aside for him. "You remembered," he said. "It's not hard to remember lavender." He paid. He thanked her. He started for the door. "Is it far?" she asked. "The cemetery." He stopped again. She was getting the sense that she was unusually good at stopping this particular man in his tracks. She wasn't sure whether that was a gift or a problem. "Half-hour up the hill on the north road," he said. She didn't say anything else. She turned back to her work table and started sorting the new shipment that had come in that morning. She heard him stand there for another few seconds, which felt like a significant choice for a man she'd never seen hesitate before. Then, "Would you walk up there with me?" She looked up. Silas Boone was standing at the door of her flower shop, hat in hand, with an expression that was somewhere between wanting something and being fairly certain he didn't deserve it. He didn't look at her the way Bramwell Voss looked at her, like she was a painting he was already deciding where to hang. He looked at her the way you look at a door you've been walking past for a long time without trying the handle. "All right," she said. She didn't know why she said it. That's not quite true. She knew exactly why, she just wasn't ready to be honest about it yet. The walk up the hill was mostly quiet, which was fine. Silas moved at a steady pace that wasn't hurrying and wasn't dawdling. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who'd covered a lot of ground on foot and stopped needing to perform the act of walking. Evelyn had grabbed her coat from the hook by the back door, and she was glad she had. The wind had real teeth this afternoon, coming down from the ridge in gusts that pushed against them sideways. She noticed he carried the flowers in his left hand and kept his right free, the way men do when they've grown up in places where you might need a hand suddenly. Old habit. She noticed a lot of old habits in him. "How big is Black Ridge?" she asked, partly to break the silence, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. 400 acres. Used to be 600. Had to sell the east pasture 2 years back when the price of cattle dropped. He said it without self-pity, just fact. It's rocky up north, never been able to do much with it. "What do you run?" "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Had more horses when Maeve was alive. She had a gelding she'd raised from a foal. I sold him the year after." He paused. "Couldn't figure out what to do with an animal that kept looking for someone who wasn't there." Evelyn thought about that for a moment. "I understand that," she said. "After my mother died, I found myself still buying 2 cups of coffee every morning for about 3 weeks. Just habit. I'd set hers down next to mine before I remembered." Silas glanced at her. "When did she pass?" 4 years ago. She left me the shop. It was already struggling then." She looked out at the hill road ahead. "I think she knew I'd be too stubborn to close it." "Are you? Stubborn?" "Desperately." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. The cemetery was a modest affair. A low iron fence, a gate that needed oiling, a few dozen markers in various stages of weathering. Silas went directly to one in the back corner, where 2 stones stood side by side beneath a small cottonwood that had managed to establish itself along the fence line. He crouched down and set the flowers against the stone on the left, rearranging them once with a deliberateness that made Evelyn look away, because it felt like something she wasn't supposed to watch. She read the names while she was looking away, because the stones faced her and there wasn't anywhere else to look. Maeve, Eleanor Boone. Then the dates. June. Eleanor Boone. 9 months. The dates were close together, less than 48 hours apart if she was reading them right. She was. He stood and stepped back and put his hat on and stood there in the wind, saying nothing for a while. "You don't have to stay," he said, without looking at her. "I just stand here a while. It's not interesting." "I didn't come for interesting," Evelyn said. He looked at her then, and she got the sense that no one had said anything quite like that to him in a very long time. They walked back down in the same comfortable quiet, and at the bottom of the hill where the road split back toward Main Street, he stopped and turned to her with the particular careful manner of a man choosing his words with great seriousness. "Same time next week?" he said. Evelyn considered that. She thought about her ledger and her seed orders and the cock on the window and the way Bramwell Voss's smile never quite reached his eyes. "Same time next week," she said. She didn't realize until she was walking home that she'd agreed without hesitation. It was the first thing she'd done without hesitation in months. The following Friday they went again, and the Friday after that, and by the 5th Friday the town had noticed, which in Red Willow was both inevitable and exhausting. Evelyn began finding small observations waiting for her. A look too long from Dottie at the post office. A comment from Mrs. Pell wrapped so carefully in concern it was almost unrecognizable. "Are you sure that's wise, dear? He's a hard man to know, and very alone." Which people said like it was a warning, when it sounded to Evelyn more like a description she already had. She was in the shop the following Wednesday, repotting a batch of primroses that had arrived too root-bound when Bramwell Voss came through the door. Voss was not a bad-looking man in the way that the word bad-looking implies an obvious deficiency. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from having always been the largest person in most rooms. He was 43 and had the hands of a man who hired other people to do difficult work. He'd been widowed himself years back. His wife had left Red Willow for her sister's home in Colorado and then simply stopped coming back, which the town called a loss, and Evelyn suspected was a reasonable decision. "Miss Hartwell," he said, settling against the doorframe with the ease of a man who finds himself comfortable everywhere he goes. "You're looking well." "Voss." She didn't look up from the primroses. "I heard you've been taking afternoon walks." "I walk frequently. It's good for you." "Up the North Hill, on Fridays, with Silas Boone." She set down the root ball she was holding and looked at him, because Evelyn Hartwell had learned early that certain conversations required eye contact to conduct properly. "What's your point?" Voss moved away from the doorframe and came to the counter in a way that was casual but not casual, the way a man moves when he's calculated the distance. "My point is that you're a smart woman. Smart enough to run a business, which is more than most. Smart enough to know when a situation is working against you." "And what situation is that?" "A flower shop that's not breaking even." He said it gently, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he already knew would land hard. I hear the Callaway outfit in Harrington has been undercutting your wholesale accounts. I hear you've got a loan note coming due in 6 months that you're not positioned to cover. He paused. I hear a lot of things. The post office is very well informed, Evelyn said. I'm offering you a solution. He spread his hands in the gesture of a reasonable man making an obvious suggestion. A partnership. Real capital. Your name stays on the shop, your expertise runs the operation, and the debt disappears. I have contacts in Denver, nursery wholesalers, horticultural distributors that you don't have access to. I can make this shop into something that actually sustains you. And what do you want in return? The pause was a half second too long. A professional relationship, he said, built on mutual respect. Evelyn looked at him. And Silas Boone? Would not be a feature of that professional relationship, no. She picked up the root ball again. I appreciate you stopping by, she said. Have a good afternoon. Voss stayed where he was for a moment. She could feel him recalculating. Think about it, he said finally. A woman in your position shouldn't let sentiment make the decision for her. I didn't know sentiment was involved, she said pleasantly. I thought you were talking about business. He left. She stood at the work table for a moment after the bell stopped moving, hands covered in potting soil, and allowed herself to be briefly furious. Not because he'd offered the partnership. She'd been expecting that for months in one form or another. But because of the half-second pause before mutual respect and because of the way he'd said Silas's name, like a category of error to be corrected. She was still angry about it when Silas came in on Friday. She didn't say anything about Voss. She tied the lavender into the bouquet and they walked up the hill, and the weather was improving enough that the walk itself was almost pleasant, which felt like a personal offense given how much she'd wanted something to be difficult about the situation. At the grave, while Silas was crouched arranging the flowers, she heard herself say, Someone offered to buy the shop's debt this week, in exchange for some conditions. He didn't look up immediately. What conditions? Stopping the Friday walks. He stood then. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the face he made when he was about to say something he'd spent time deciding whether to say. Who? Voss. A muscle worked in his jaw. I see. I said no. I know you did. He said it with such uncomplicated certainty that she almost laughed. You're not someone who says yes to things that way. You've known me 5 weeks. I've watched you deal with Dottie Marsh for 3 years, he said. That tells a person more than 5 weeks usually does. This time she did laugh, which startled both of them. They walked back down the hill in the kind of quiet that was comfortable rather than empty, which was different from all the other quiets she'd collected in her life, and she was aware of the difference in a way she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for. The following Tuesday, her shop window got broken. She found it at 6 a.m. when she unlocked the front door, a spiderweb crack in the lower left pane, the kind a rock makes. No note, no explanation. Just the damage and the cold air coming through and the sick weight of understanding exactly what it meant. She was boarding up the window when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. I'm fine, she said, before she turned around, because it was Silas, which she knew by the sound. I know you are, he said. He took the hammer from her hand with a calm efficiency that was annoying in its usefulness, and finished boarding the pane while she held the edges steady. This was deliberate. Yes. You should tell Calder when. I will. She watched him drive the last nail. This is not your fault. He paused on the second to last nail. Just a pause. Barely there. Silas, I mean that. I know you mean it, he said, and finished the nail. That doesn't make me the one who's wrong. She took the hammer back when he was done, and turned to look at him directly in the way she'd learned was the only register that fully got through to him. If you stop coming on Fridays because of this, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. He met her eyes. That would bother me, he said. More than you probably think. Good, she said. Then don't. He came the next Friday, but 2 weeks after the window, she arrived at the shop in the morning to find an envelope on the counter. Inside was a single piece of paper in a handwriting she didn't recognize. 3 words only. Stay away from Boone. She burned it in the stove and told no one except Sheriff Calder Wynne, who was a compact, efficient man with 30 years of experience and the particular patience of someone who had learned to wait for people to do the thing you already knew they were going to do. He wrote it down in his notebook and told her to keep her doors locked and said he'd be paying some attention to the situation. Voss? She asked him. I'd rather have evidence than suspicion, he said. The Friday after the note, Silas didn't come. She waited until 4, then until 4:30, which was past when she usually closed in winter. She told herself he'd been delayed by ranch work. She told herself 100 reasonable things, the way you do when you already know the unreasonable thing is true. She closed the shop at 5 and rode out to Black Ridge the next morning. The ranch was rougher than she'd imagined. Not neglected exactly, but the kind of place that had been maintained by one person doing the work of several, and the arithmetic showed. The fence posts were solid, the barn was clean, but the cabin's front step had a loose board, and the window boxes that must have once held something were empty and had been for long enough that even the dirt had washed out of them. Silas was in the yard when she rode up, splitting wood with the steady mechanical rhythm of a man who'd been doing it long enough that he didn't have to think about it. He stopped when he saw her. "You didn't come on Friday," she said. "I thought—" He set the axe handle against the stump. "I thought it was better." Better for who? He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent considerable time constructing a reasonable argument and is now watching it come apart under the weight of a single question. "For you," he said. "I don't recall asking you to make decisions for me." "I know that." "Then why are you?" He looked out toward the ridge for a moment. The wind came across the yard and pushed at them both. "Because I've watched someone I cared about get hurt and I didn't stop it, and I don't—" He stopped, started again with different words. "I don't have a lot of things I'm sure about anymore, but I'm sure that you're worth more than whatever trouble comes with knowing me." "Silas." She waited until he looked at her. "That's not actually your call to make." He was quiet. "You don't get to decide I'm too fragile to choose my own life," she said. "That's mine. I decide that." He opened his mouth to answer. That was when the smoke started. She saw it first because she was facing the barn, a thin, dark thread of it rising from the eave on the far side. And then even as she was registering what she was seeing, the thread became a column and the column became wrong. The wrong color and the wrong speed, and Silas turned and saw it at the same moment, and they were both moving before either of them had said a word. The horses were screaming before they got the barn doors open. That sound an animal makes when it has located danger and the exit simultaneously, all panic and raw voice. Silas went in first, and Evelyn went in right behind him without thinking about it, because the horses couldn't get out on their own, and there wasn't a world in which she stood in the yard and watched. The smoke was low and dense, collecting at the ceiling level, while the fire was still small enough to be in one corner only. She could see the 2 horses in the far stalls, a bay gelding throwing itself against the stall gate, and a smaller gray that had gone still in the way the animals sometimes do when they've moved past fear into something worse. Silas went for the bay, she went for the gray, and the gray let her get the gate open and get a hand on its halter because she didn't rush and she didn't yell, and she'd spent enough time around frightened things to know that noise was never the answer. Getting them out took 4 minutes that felt like 40. The bay went sideways coming out the door and caught Silas's shoulder with its hindquarters, hard enough to send him into the doorframe. She heard the impact and saw him catch himself and keep moving because there wasn't time to stop. They got both horses into the far paddock, and the bay circled for another 3 minutes before it settled, and the gray just stood with its head dropped and breathed. By then, the fire was out, or rather, it had burned through whatever had started it, a pile of old hay close to the east wall, and run out of easy fuel before it reached the structural timber. The wall was scorched, the hay was gone, and the corner was a mess of charred debris and ash, but the barn was standing. Silas stood in the middle of the burned corner with a lantern that he'd picked up from the ash pile. He turned it over in his hands. "This isn't mine," he said. His voice was quiet and very level in the way that was not the same as flat. Evelyn stood beside him and looked at the lantern and understood what he wasn't saying. "Someone started this," she said. "Yes." "On purpose." "Yes." He set the lantern down carefully. "And that's not all." He straightened and looked toward the cabin. "When I went in for the buckets, the front door was standing open. I left it closed." She followed his gaze. "They went inside while we were getting the horses out." The day had gone very still around them, the way the air sometimes does in the moment, between when something bad has happened and when you fully understood it. "What would they be looking for?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment too long. Silas. "Maeve kept records," he said. "Journals. Papers from before we married." He looked out at the ridge. "There was something she found out in the North Basin. She wrote it down. He stopped. "I never went looking for it. After she died, I left things where they were." "What did she find?" He shook his head slowly, not refusing to answer, but working out how to get to the answer from whatever complicated place he'd stored it. I don't know exactly. She talked about the northern land sometimes. Said there was something wrong with the way Voss always wanted to buy it. Said a man doesn't want worthless land that badly unless he knows something you don't. The smoke smell was still on both of them. One of the horses coughed in the paddock. We need to find whatever she wrote down, Evelyn said, before whoever went into your cabin finds it first. Silas looked at her. You said I don't get to decide things for you, he said. That goes both ways. It does, she agreed, which means right now you don't get to decide to do this alone. The silence between them was not comfortable this time, but it was honest, which was better. All right, he said finally. They walked toward the cabin together through the thin, gray afternoon light, and neither of them spoke, and the wind came down off the ridge behind them like it was following them in. The cabin was cold inside in the way that meant the fire in the stove had gone out hours ago, and whoever had come through the front door while Silas and Evelyn were pulling horses out of the smoke hadn't bothered to close it properly on the way out. The latch hadn't caught. That small detail, the latch not catching, made Evelyn angrier than almost anything else about the afternoon, in the irrational way that small, careless details sometimes carry more insult than the large, deliberate ones. Silas stood in the middle of his front room and looked at what they'd done to it. It wasn't destruction, exactly. It was more careful than that, which was worse in its way. The books on the shelf beside the window had been pulled out and stacked rather than thrown. The drawer of the side table was open but not dumped. Someone had gone through the place with the particular efficiency of a person who knew what they were looking for and didn't want to announce that they'd been there until they were well clear of the property. The letters, Silas said. He went to the back of the cabin, to the small room that had been a bedroom and was now something harder to name. Not a storage room exactly, but the place where things ended up when you couldn't throw them away and couldn't stand to look at them every day. Evelyn stayed in the doorway and watched him crouch beside the old trunk at the foot of the bed and lift the lid. The letters were still there, most of them. They'd been moved. She could see from the way his hands stilled slightly when he looked at them that something about the arrangement was wrong. But they were there. One journal is missing, he said after a moment. He sat back on his heels and held a small, dark-covered book that was clearly not the one he was looking for because he looked at it with the expression of a man holding the wrong thing. She kept two, he said. The everyday one, and one she called her thinking book. That one she kept separate. He looked at the trunk. It's not here. Evelyn came into the room and crouched beside him. The trunk held what lives leave behind when they're cut short. Folded letters, a handful of photographs, a child's knitted cap in pale yellow, a small pair of shoes that had clearly never been worn more than once. She did not look at those long. What was in the thinking book? I don't know. He set the other journal back in the trunk. I never read it. She was private about it. After she died, He stopped. I didn't read any of it for a long time, and then when I finally could, the thinking book wasn't where the others were, and I thought maybe I just lost it, or she'd had it somewhere else. I didn't push it. But now someone took it. Yes. They looked at each other across the open trunk. Voss, Evelyn said, he's the only one with something to gain from what Maeve might have written about the North Basin land. Silas stood, slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose shoulder had taken a real impact from a panicked horse less than an hour ago. She told me once that she'd found something out there. I thought she meant a view or a good stand of wildflowers. She had a way of finding things like that, things worth noticing. He walked back to the front room, but the way she said it, there was something else in it, like she was still working out what to do with what she knew. And she wrote it in the thinking book. That'd be my guess. Evelyn followed him to the front room and stood by the window, looking out at the yard where the paddock fence was barely visible in the failing light. The smoke smell from the barn had followed them inside, or maybe it was in their clothes. Either way, it was there, sitting at the back of the throat, unpleasant and specific. We need to talk to Calder Wynne, she said. We do. Silas was at the stove, opening the firebox with a practiced hand, not looking at her. In the morning. Tonight I need to check the barn wall, make sure there's nothing that'll open up again in the cold. I'll help. You don't have to. Silas. She said his name the way she'd learned worked, which was flatly and without apology. Stop doing that. He paused with a log half into the firebox. Deciding alone, she said. You've been doing it so long you don't even notice you're doing it. He put the log in, shut the firebox, stood with his back to her for a moment longer than necessary. Old habit, he said. I know, she said. Work on it. Something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not much, but she was paying enough attention to catch it. They checked the barn wall together. The scorched wood was stable for now, though they both agreed it needed proper repair before the next hard frost. Silas nailed a sheet of canvas over the worst of it while Evelyn held the torch, and they worked in a silence that was efficient rather than uncomfortable. The kind of silence that develops between people who figured out how to operate in the same space without getting in each other's way. When they finished, the horses had settled, and the gray was eating from its hay rack with the philosophical calm of an animal that had processed its crisis and moved on. "She's all right," Evelyn said. Gray was always the sensible one. Silas leaned on the paddock rail and looked at both horses in the dim torchlight. "I should put them in the south corral overnight, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case whoever set that fire decides they want to come back and finish what they started." He said it with no particular inflection, just fact. "I'll sit up." She looked at him. "All right. You should get back to town. It's dark already." "I know what time it is." "Evelyn, I'm not leaving you here alone after someone burned your barn and went through your house." She handed him the torch and dusted her hands on her coat. "I'll stay in the front room. You sit up in the barn if you need to. We can argue about it, or we can just do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said, which was not at all a criticism the way he said it. "My mother used to say the same thing," she said. She meant it as a compliment. They managed 4 hours of sleep between them. She on the settee under a blanket she found in the cedar chest, he coming in from the barn sometime after midnight and sitting in the straight-back chair near the stove without waking her, which meant she woke around 4 and found him asleep sitting upright with his hat on his knee and decided the most useful thing she could do was let him have another hour and start the fire. She found coffee in the tin on the shelf above the stove. Coarse ground, strong, the kind of coffee that was primarily a vehicle for getting yourself vertical and ambulatory rather than a sensory experience. She made it and sat at the kitchen table with a cup while the stove heated the front room back to something livable, and she looked at the room in the early gray light and thought about a woman named Maeve who had put wildflowers in a jar on this table every Friday and thought that flowers in a house meant someone was paying attention. The room still had small signs of her in it, if you knew to look. The curtains at the window were a faded blue-green that was too particular a color choice to be accidental. The shelf above the window had small brackets carved into simple leaf shapes that someone had done by hand. There was a chip in the edge of the table's corner that had been sanded smooth rather than left rough, which was the kind of thing a person does when they care about a table. Small, careful choices. A house someone had lived in with intention. Silas woke at 5:15 and looked briefly disoriented, which was the most human she'd seen him look since she'd known him. He got his bearings in about 3 seconds and then looked at the coffee cup in her hands and then at the stove. "You made coffee," he said. "I did." "I didn't hear you." "You were very thoroughly asleep." She got up and poured him a cup and set it on the table and sat back down. "How's your shoulder?" He rotated it experimentally and winced in a way he immediately tried to contain. "Fine." "You should have someone look at it." "It's fine." That word doesn't mean what you use it to mean. He drank his coffee and looked at her over the rim of the cup with the expression of a man who had run out of argument but was not entirely ready to concede. They rode into Red Willow at first light, and Silas went to the livery and Evelyn went directly to the sheriff's office, where Calder Wynne was already at his desk with his own coffee and a ledger that he shut when she came in. He was 61, compact and gray-haired, with the kind of patience that doesn't come naturally but gets built over decades of dealing with people at their worst. She told him about the barn, the lantern, the cabin, the missing journal. She told him about Voss's visits to the shop, the business proposition, the conditions attached to it. She told him about the broken window and the note 3 weeks ago. Wynne wrote it all down in his careful, economical handwriting and didn't interrupt her once, which she appreciated. When she'd finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The lantern," he said. "Silas still have it?" "It's in the barn. I'll come out and look at it." He closed his notebook. "I want to be straight with you, Miss Hartwell. What you're describing is serious. The broken window I might have written off to general mischief. The note's in a different category. A man's barn burning down and his property searched the same night. That's a campaign, not an accident. I know. I can't arrest Voss on what I've got, but I can start asking questions in places where he'd prefer I wasn't asking." He stood. "In the meantime, I'd like both of you to be careful about what you say and where. Whoever this is has been patient about it. Patient people wait for mistakes." Silas came in from the livery while they were still talking, and Wynne repeated most of it for his benefit. Silas listened without expression, which Evelyn had learned was not the same as not listening. When Wynne had finished, Silas said, "He's tried to buy the North Basin 4 times in 9 years. Started low, came up gradually. Last time was 2 years ago, twice what that land is worth by any obvious measure." Wynne's pen paused. "How much over market?" "Double, maybe more." Silas looked at his hands on his knees. "I kept saying no because Maeve asked me not to sell it. She never told me why exactly, just said she had a feeling about it." He paused. "I should have asked her more questions." "You didn't know," Evelyn said. "No." He said it without absolution in it, which was how he said most things about the past. "But I know now." They left the sheriff's office and stood on the boardwalk in the thin morning light. The town was waking up around them. The bakery 2 doors down was putting its first loaves out, the blacksmith's was already ringing, and Dottie Marsh had the post office door open and was very carefully arranging something in the front window in a way that allowed her to see the street perfectly. "You should open the shop," Silas said. "I should." Evelyn looked up at the street. "What are you going to do?" "Go back out and start on the barn wall. I've got timber cut that'll work for the repair." He paused. "I'm going to look through the rest of what's in that trunk tonight, see if Maeve left anything in the other journals about what she found up north." "Tell me what you find." He looked at her. "I will." It was such a simple exchange, the kind of thing people say to each other when they've decided to be on the same side, but it sat differently than simple things usually did, and she was aware of that as she walked down the boardwalk to the shop and unlocked the front door and started the morning routine. The shop was cold and quiet in the way it always was at that hour, the flower smell concentrated and green without the warmth of the day to thin it out. She lit the stove in the back room and started going through the morning's water check on the standing arrangements, moving through the familiar motions with the part of her mind that didn't need to think about them, leaving the rest of her attention free to work on what she'd learned. Voss wanted the North Basin badly enough to orchestrate a sustained campaign of pressure and intimidation against a man who'd never done anything to him except refuse to sell. That was a particular kind of want, not greed exactly, or not only greed. Greed moved when the price got high enough. This hadn't moved in 9 years. That meant Voss knew something specific about that land that made its actual value entirely different from its apparent value. Maeve had known something too, or suspected it, had written it in a journal that was now gone. The question was whether she'd left anything else. She was still working through it when the bell above the door rang at 9:30, and she turned from the work table expecting a customer. It was Cora Denny, who was 23 and worked at the land registry office and had been one of Evelyn's occasional customers since she'd moved to Red Willow 2 years ago. She had a freckled, open face and the slightly overwhelmed look of a person who'd come in to say something and was now second-guessing the decision. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "I heard about what happened out at Black Ridge." "News travels," Evelyn said. "It does." Cora came to the counter, lowering her voice in the instinctive way people do when they've decided they're going to say something they're not entirely sure they should say. "I work land records. You know that. And I probably shouldn't say this, but..." She stopped, looked at the door, looked back. "Someone has been pulling records on the Black Ridge North Basin parcel, requesting surveys, old deeds, water table assessments, for about the past year." Evelyn set down the clippers she was holding. "Someone," she said. "The request came through a land agent, Billings, Harrington area, but land agents work for someone." Cora's jaw was set in the way of a young woman who had talked herself into doing something she knew was right and was going through with it despite the nerves. The kinds of documents they were pulling. Water table surveys, aquifer assessments, that kind of thing. You don't pull those for grazing land. You pull those when you think there's water underground. The word landed in the cold morning air of the shop and sat there. Water. "How far underground?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know, but the assessments they were pulling date back 20 years. Whoever's doing this has been building a picture of that basin for a long time." Cora straightened. "I'm probably going to lose my position if it comes out I told you, but what's been going on out at Black Ridge isn't right, and I couldn't just sit on it." "It won't come from me," Evelyn said. "I'll make sure of that." After Cora left, Evelyn stood at the work table for a long moment and let the pieces arrange themselves. A massive underground water source beneath land that appeared worthless. Years of quiet document pulling through intermediaries. 9 years of trying to buy a parcel of land at above market prices from a widowed rancher who kept saying no. A barn fire, a stolen journal, a campaign of pressure designed to isolate Silas from the one person who'd started paying attention to his life again. She locked up the shop at noon, saddled her horse, and rode to Black Ridge. Silas was on the roof of the barn when she arrived, moving along the damaged section with the careful balance of a man who'd done roof work enough to do it without being cavalier about it. He saw her ride in and climb down with more speed than was probably wise given his shoulder, because he could tell from the way she was moving that she had something. She told him about Cora and the land records. He stood in the yard and listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a full 20 seconds, which was long even for him. "Water," he said. "Underground. The assessment suggests something substantial enough that someone's been tracking it for 2 decades. She watched his face. Maeve was right. That's what she knew. That's what she wrote in the thinking journal. Silas turned and looked north, toward the high, rocky section of his land that was visible from the yard as a dark ridgeline against the pale sky. "There's a creek up there," he said, "or what used to be a creek. It's been dry at the surface as long as I've had the place. But in spring, the wildflowers come up thick along the bed even when everything else is dry. Because there's water underneath it. Because there's water underneath it." He said it slowly, working out the shape of something. Maeve used to say the wildflowers up there bloomed first every year, even before anything else on the property. She thought it was beautiful. She never thought it was... He stopped. She was smarter than she knew, or smarter than I gave her credit for. She knew exactly what she was looking at, Evelyn said. She just needed time to put it together. That's what the thinking book was for. Silas was quiet again. Then, "There was a rhyme she used to sing. I thought it was just something she made up. She did that sometimes, little songs for June." He turned back from the ridge. She'd sing it when she came back from the North Basin. "Where twin cottonwoods guard the sleeping creek, dig where summer flowers bloom first." I thought it was just words. Evelyn stared at him. "Say that again," she said. He repeated it. She heard it the second time the way you hear something when you're listening for the shape of it rather than just the sound. "That's not a song," she said. "That's directions." Silas looked at her. "Twin cottonwoods," she said. "Are there 2 cottonwoods up there? Paired ones?" He was already nodding slowly, like a man watching something he thought was behind him come around in front. "Yeah, old ones near the dry creek bed. Maeve liked to sit between them when she went up there." He paused. "She buried a tin box once," she told me. "Said she was leaving something up there for safekeeping. I thought she meant a keepsake, something sentimental." "She didn't," Evelyn said. "No." He looked toward the ridge again, and now his expression had changed, something in it that was part grief and part something harder to name. Maybe pride. Maybe the complicated feeling of being told that someone you loved was even more capable than you already knew. "She didn't." They stood in the yard with the wind moving around them and the barn repair half finished overhead, and the shape of what Maeve had done, the patience of it, the care, settled around them both. Silas had looked at his North Basin land for 9 years and seen worthless rock and wildflowers and a dry creek that was no use to anyone. Maeve had looked at the same land and seen something that needed protecting, and she'd done what she could to protect it with what she had. A journal no one was supposed to read, a rhyme that sounded like nothing, a tin box buried between 2 trees. "We need to get up there," Evelyn said. "The weather's turning." Silas looked at the sky to the northwest, where a line of cloud was building at the ridgeline with the particular gray-blue heaviness of incoming snow. "Could be a storm before tonight. Then we go tomorrow. Early. Wind should come with us." "Agreed." He nodded. The muscle in his jaw worked once, which was, she'd learned, the face he made when he'd made up his mind about something and was sealing it shut. "I'll ride in and talk to him tonight. Tell him what you learned from Cora. Don't go alone after dark." He looked at her. "I'll be fine. Silas, I'll take the South Road. It's well traveled, even at night." He paused. "I'm not careless. I'm careful in a way that doesn't always look it from the outside." That was fair, she thought. It was also one of the more honest things he'd said to her. "All right." She rode back as the afternoon light went thin, and the first real bite of the coming storm got into the wind. She was halfway to town when she noticed the rider a quarter mile back, keeping pace with her on the parallel track that ran along the tree line. She didn't change her speed. She kept her eyes forward, and she thought carefully about what she was looking at and decided it was probably a ranch hand heading back from the eastern properties. Probably. She went faster anyway, and the rider behind her didn't close the gap, and she was back on Main Street by 4:30 with the sky going pewter overhead and the first scattered flakes coming down. She locked the shop and went home and sat at her kitchen table with the account ledger she hadn't been able to look at properly in 2 weeks. The numbers hadn't improved in her absence. The loan note was real, the timeline on it was real, and Voss's offer, the one that had conditions attached to it she refused to meet, was also real. She turned that over for a while. Voss had offered to make the debt disappear. Now she understood why. It wasn't about her exactly, and it wasn't entirely about Silas. It was about the North Basin. Getting rid of the relationship between her and Silas was about removing the one person who'd gotten close enough to him to notice things that Voss couldn't afford to have noticed. She was more useful to Voss isolated and indebted than informed and allied. Understanding that didn't make the numbers in the ledger any better, but it clarified what she was actually dealing with, and clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, was something you could work with. She was going to close the ledger and start supper when someone knocked at her back door. She went still. Nobody knocked at her back door. It didn't face any street. It opened onto the alley behind the row of shops, which was where deliveries came and nothing else. She picked up the fire poker from beside the stove, which she recognized as both practical and slightly absurd, and went to the door. It's Silas. She put the poker down and opened the door. He was standing in the alley in the snow, which was coming properly now, and he had the look of a man who had ridden into town and gone around the back way because the front way had someone watching it. Wynne saw the rider too, he said, coming in out of the snow and pulling the door shut behind him. He had Denny Farrow follow him. It was one of Voss's hands, Cutter, the one with the lame left hand. Evelyn leaned against the kitchen table. He's having us followed. He's been having us followed. Silas took off his hat and turned it in his hands, which was the thing he did when he was working through something. Wynne wants to come to the North Basin tomorrow. He says we go before first light, before anyone can track where we're headed. That makes sense. He also said, Silas paused. He said to be prepared for the possibility that what Maeve left is significant enough to make Voss dangerous in a different way than he's been so far. Dangerous and cornered is a different problem than dangerous and patient. The snow tapped quietly at the window behind her. Are you scared? She asked. He considered that with the seriousness he brought to most things. No, he said. I spent 5 years being scared of everything, scared to touch her things, scared to change anything in the house, scared to... He stopped, started differently. I don't have much fear left over for Voss. What do you have fear left over for? He looked at her across the kitchen, and what was in his face was not something she'd seen there before. Not the level, careful steadiness that was his normal register, but something rawer than that, something that hadn't been aired out in a long time. Getting this wrong, he said, whatever this is. I'm not very good at it. I haven't been this in a long time. He gestured slightly at the space between them, which was specific enough that she understood exactly what he meant. And I'm aware that I'm rough around the edges in ways that don't always serve the situation. Silas, she looked at him steadily. The edges are fine. He was quiet for a moment. I mean that, she said. The stove ticked. The snow came down outside the window. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his shoulder that wasn't fine and 5 years of grief that had worn him down to something durable and honest, and she thought about what Mrs. Pell had said. He's a hard man to know. And thought that wasn't true at all. He wasn't hard to know. He was hard to start knowing. There was a difference. You should stay, she said. It's not safe for either of us to be alone tonight, and the storm's getting worse. You can have the settee. It's more comfortable than a barn chair. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. She made supper, beans and cornbread, because it was what she had and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And they ate at the kitchen table with the storm settling in around the little house and the snow making the alley outside the window into something quiet and sealed off and separate from the rest of the world. He didn't say much, but he ate 2 helpings without being asked, which told her more about how his day had gone than anything he could have said. After, she washed the plates and he dried them without being asked to do that either, and she thought about how much you can learn about a person from watching them do a small ordinary thing. He dried the plates carefully and put them where she indicated without question. No assumptions about where things went or how things worked, just attention to what was actually in front of him. She gave him the blanket from the cedar chest and said goodnight from the doorway. Evelyn, he said. She stopped. Whatever Maeve put in that box up there, he said, whatever she found, I want to do right by it, by what she'd have wanted. He looked at the blanket in his hands. She was a good woman. She'd have liked you, I think. You're the kind of person she respected. Evelyn stood in the doorway with that for a moment. That's one of the kindest things anyone said to me in a long time, she said quietly. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. She went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the storm work itself through the night, and somewhere in the middle of it she heard him get up and check the front door and the back door and sit down again, and she thought, that's what he does. That's who he is. He gets up in the dark and checks the doors. She fell asleep thinking it was a very good thing to be, all things considered. By 4 a.m, the storm had thinned to a scatter, and by 4:30, Silas had the stove going and the coffee on, and she came out to find him sitting at the table with the other journal, the everyday one, not the missing thinking book, open in his hands. He looked up when she came in. She wrote about the cottonwoods, he said. In the last entry before she got sick, she wrote, I want Silas to know about the water, but I don't know how to make him believe something he can't see yet. I'll put it all on the ground and trust that the right moment will come. He closed the journal. She trusted that the right moment would come. Evelyn poured her coffee and sat across from him. It did, she said. It just took a while. He looked at the closed journal cover for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket, stood, and said, Calder will be at the East Road Junction at 5. We should go. She finished her coffee and got her coat, and they went out into the quiet dark before the town was awake, with the snow lying clean and untracked across the alley, and the North Ridge waiting for them against a sky that was just beginning to lighten at its far edge. Calder Wynne was already at the East Road Junction when they got there, sitting his horse with the stillness of a man who'd been waiting long enough that he'd stopped looking at the road and started looking at the sky instead. He had a rifle in the scabbard and a deputy's badge on his coat that he rarely wore in town because he said it made people nervous in the wrong direction, which told you something about his approach to the job. Storm left good tracking snow, he said, by way of greeting, which cuts both ways. Meaning we can see if anyone follows, Silas said, and they can see where we went. Meaning exactly that, so we move steady and we pay attention. Wynne looked at Evelyn without commentary. He'd stopped being surprised by her presence in situations where most people would have found a reason to be elsewhere. You sure about the cottonwoods? Silas is sure, she said. I'm sure about Maeve's journal entry. Put those two things together and I'm sure enough to ride out in the dark. Good enough. He turned his horse north. Let's go before the town wakes up. They rode the north road in a single file, Silas leading because it was his land and his dark, and the snow made the ground quiet under the horses' hooves in a way that felt deliberate, like the world was cooperating with their attempt at discretion. The sky to the east had moved from black to a deep, grudging gray. Not light yet, but the suggestion of it. The kind of gray that means another hour. Silas had ridden this land for 9 years and could do it in his sleep, which was nearly what he was doing. He knew where the ground went soft near the spring-fed depression a quarter mile off the main track. He knew which section of fence needed the widest berth because the post had shifted over winter and the wire was lower than it looked. He knew the stand of juniper that came up suddenly on the left and had unseated more than one visitor who wasn't expecting it. He also knew, somewhere in the part of himself that had been paying a different kind of attention since the barn fire, that someone else had been up here recently. The snow last night had covered most of it, but there were depressions near the north fence line that were slightly sunken in the way of tracks that had partially filled, not fresh enough to be from this morning and not old enough to be entirely smooth. He didn't say anything about it yet. He noted it and kept moving. The north basin opened up after the tree line broke. A wide, rocky shelf of land that sloped gradually toward the dry creek bed and was as unpromising a piece of terrain as you'd find in the county if you didn't know what to look for. In summer, Silas knew, it went against its own appearance. The wildflowers came up thick along the creek bed in colors you didn't expect from such sparse soil, and the grass stayed greener here longer into the dry months than it had any logical reason to. He'd looked at that and thought, Maeve would have loved this. He'd thought it without wondering why. He'd just let it be beautiful and let it be hers in the way some places belong to people who love them. The cottonwoods were at the far edge of the basin, right where the dry creek bed curved and the ground dropped slightly before the east ridge rose up. They were old trees, older than the ranch, older than most things in this part of Wyoming, with the wide, silvery trunks and high branching that old cottonwoods get, standing about 20 feet apart in a pairing that was close enough to feel deliberate even though nothing had put them there but water and time. Silas pulled up between them and sat his horse. She used to sit here, he said, in the summers. She'd ride up with a lunch and sit between these two trees and read. He dismounted and handed his reins to Wynne without looking. She called it her quiet place. I never came up with her. I thought she wanted it to herself. He stood in the snow between the two cottonwoods and looked at the ground. The creek bed was 10 feet to the east, just visible as a slight channel in the basin floor. The snow lay clean and unmarked between the trees. She wrote, "Dig where summer flowers bloom first," Evelyn said. She dismounted and was standing at the edge of the cottonwood space, looking at the ground with the focused attention of someone working a problem. The flowers would come up where the ground stayed warm enough earliest, which would be south-facing, Silas said, between the roots. The south-facing side of the root base stays warmer longer. He crouched at the base of the left cottonwood on its south side, where the roots made a natural hollow where they went into the earth. The snow here was slightly thinner, caught in the root structure rather than lying flat. He pulled his glove off and pressed his hand to the ground, not frozen. He looked up at Evelyn. She nodded. He used the short-handled spade Wynne had thought to bring, working carefully in the space between the roots. The ground was harder than it would have been in warm weather, but not frozen solid. The tree's root mass had insulated it. He went down 6 inches and hit something. Not rock. Something with edges. He put the spade aside and used his hands. The iron box was small, maybe 12 inches across, 8 deep, with a latch that had gone orange with rust but held its integrity. He pulled it free of the earth and held it between his knees and looked at it for a moment without opening it. Wynne had dismounted. He and Evelyn stood on either side of Silas, and none of them spoke, and the silence in the North Basin was very complete. No wind right now, no bird sound, just the quiet and the gray sky and the 2 old trees standing over them. Silas worked the latch. It resisted, then gave. The lid came up with the sound of a seal breaking on stale air. Inside, wrapped in oilskin to keep the damp out, was a bundle of documents. Survey papers folded and refolded until the creases were soft. 2 official-looking deeds with stamps on them, the ink faded but still legible. A handwritten ledger of some kind, small-paged and dense, and beneath all of that, the dark-covered notebook he recognized instantly. Maeve's thinking book. He didn't reach for it right away. He picked up the top survey document and unfolded it carefully, and Wynne leaned over his shoulder to look at it. It was a water survey, professional, with a surveyor's stamp in the lower right corner dated 11 years back. It mapped the North Basin in detail, but what it was mapping was not the surface terrain. It was the subsurface geology, with contour lines indicating a large, deep aquifer running beneath the basin at a depth of 40 to 60 feet. A formation the survey described in his technical notes as a closed basin artesian system, meaning it wasn't dependent on surface precipitation. It was fed by snowmelt from the high ridge on a geological timescale, a deep reserve that wouldn't deplete in ordinary drought conditions. Wynne made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "How much water?" Evelyn asked, reading over Silas's other shoulder. Wynne pointed to a number in the technical notes. At that depth, with that formation, enough to irrigate several hundred acres sustained. Enough to supply this whole valley through a dry summer. He straightened. This valley's had 3 significant droughts in the last 20 years. If someone controlled access to this water, they'd control everything, Silas said. He said it quietly, without inflection, in the way of a man putting a word to something he'd understood all at once and needed a second to settle into. Everything. Every ranch in the valley that ran cattle through a dry summer. Every family that depended on the creek systems that fed from the ridge. Control the water, and you controlled who survived the droughts and who didn't, who had to sell and to whom and at what price. It wasn't just profit. It was the whole valley's future, structured to flow through a single pair of hands. Voss's hands. He's known about this for over a decade, Evelyn said. He had his own survey done, didn't he? Cora said the records request went back 20 years. He did it before Silas and Maeve bought the ranch. Wynne had the ledger open now, turning the small pages with careful fingers. If I'm reading this right, these are records of attempted purchase, every time Voss tried to acquire this parcel before the Boones got it and after. The amounts, the dates, the agents he used. He looked at Silas. Maeve documented all of it. She was building a case, Evelyn said. She was building a record, Wynne said, which was a distinction that mattered, in case something happened to her. She knew what she had, and she knew Voss knew she had the land, and she put it all down in a form that could be read and understood by someone who wasn't her. He closed the ledger carefully. She wasn't a lawyer, but she thought like one. Silas had picked up the thinking book. He held it without opening it. She knew she was sick before I did, he said. She never told me how sick until it was... He stopped. She was protecting the record, in case she didn't make it out the other side. Nobody said anything to that. The wind had started up again, coming down from the east ridge in the directionless way it moved across open basin, and it went through their coats with the specific cold of 8 in the morning in Wyoming in early spring. The horses moved behind them, shifting their weight. Wynn had the documents organized in the oilskin with the care of a man who understood that he was holding evidence rather than reading material. Silas opened the thinking book. Evelyn watched his face. He read the first page, then the second. His expression didn't change the way it does in stories, where people's faces become readable maps of their interior states in the moment of revelation. His face stayed level, which she'd learned was how he looked when something was hitting him hardest. The more it mattered, the more still he became, like a man bracing into a wind. He read for about 3 minutes. Then he closed the book. She knew about the aquifer from the beginning, he said. Somebody approached her before we married. A land agent who said he represented private interests, wouldn't name them, who wanted to buy a parcel of the North Basin even then, before we'd moved there. She thought it was strange that anyone wanted that particular piece of land and started asking around. She found an old survey at the county office that had been partially misfiled. She put it together herself. He paused. She didn't tell me because she said I'd want to act immediately and she thought patience was the right move. She wanted to document everything before we did anything with it. She was right, Wynn said. She usually was. He tucked the thinking book inside his coat against his chest. The land agent who approached her, she has a name. Harlan Creed. He works out of Billings. Or he did 11 years ago. Wynn's expression sharpened. I know that name. Voss uses him, Evelyn said. Cora said the records request came through a Billings agent. Same man, Wynn said, which connects the survey acquisition, the records request, and the original approach to Maeve. All to Voss, through one agent over 11 years. He looked at Silas. That's a prosecutable chain. If we can get it to the right people, Silas said, that's my problem to solve. Wynn rewrapped the documents in the oilskin and tucked the bundle inside his own coat. This comes with me. I'm going to ride to the county seat today. Don't want this sitting in my office overnight. I want this in front of Judge Harlow before Voss knows we've been up here. He was already moving towards his horse when Evelyn heard it. The sound was wrong. Hoofbeats on the trail they'd come up, and they were not slow and exploratory. They were fast and purposeful. The sound of someone who already knew where they were going. She turned and saw Silas turn at the same moment, and they both looked toward the trail junction, where the basin opened onto the north road, and that was when Bramwell Voss came around the tree line at a canter with 2 riders behind him. He pulled up 30 feet away. His horse was blowing hard. He'd pushed it to get here, which meant he'd had someone on the road who'd seen them leave town and had ridden ahead to cut around. For a moment, nobody moved. Voss looked at the 3 of them, at the oilskin tucked under Wynn's arm, at the fresh dug earth between the cottonwood roots, and Evelyn watched him understand exactly 3 seconds. Sheriff, he said. His voice was even in a way that took effort to make even. I'd like to know what's been dug up on private property this morning. Private property, Wynn said pleasantly, belonging to Silas Boone, who is standing right there and gave his full consent, so there's no issue. What's in the documents? Not your concern. I think you'll find it very much my concern. Voss moved his horse forward 3 steps, and the 2 riders behind him moved with him, which was a choreography Evelyn had seen before in a different context. It was the arrangement of men who'd planned what they were going to do if the conversation went a particular way. That land has been under a purchase dispute for years. There may be contested title issues that make anything found on it. There are no title disputes, Silas said. He stepped forward 1 step, which put him between Voss and the sheriff in a way that was simple and unambiguous. The deed is clean. You know that, because you tried to manufacture a dispute 3 years ago and it didn't hold up. Voss looked at him with the expression of a man who had run out of the kind of patience that was really just confidence that things would go his way. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Boone. I think I do, Silas said. I think you've been trying to buy this land for 11 years because of what's under it. I think you had a survey done before we ever moved here. I think you had my wife approached by your agent when she was still single, and when that didn't work, you waited. You kept making offers. When I kept refusing them, you escalated. His voice stayed level. My barn, my wife's journal, my window. He meant Evelyn's window, she understood. And none of it worked, because you were working against people who are too stubborn to accommodate you. Voss's jaw was tight. You're making accusations you can't back up. Sheriff Wynn has the documentation that backs every word. Silas looked at him steadily. It's over, Voss. Whatever you plan to do with this water, it's done. Something went across Voss's face that was past calculation now. That was the moment Evelyn would remember later, the moment she could see him make the decision to stop managing the situation and just end it. He'd been a patient man for 11 years, and patience had run out. "Creed," he said. The man on his left, the larger of the two riders, reached back toward his saddlebag with a movement that was entirely specific. Wynn's rifle was out before the man's hand closed on whatever he was reaching for. "Don't," the sheriff said, and there was nothing complicated in his voice, just the word. Creed's hand stopped. "Get your hand away from there slowly," Wynn said, "and then put both hands where I can see them." The man did it. The three of them stood their horses facing the three of them standing on the ground, and the basin was very quiet, and the distance between a bad situation and a worse one was about as thin as the morning air. Voss looked at the rifle, and then at Wynn, and then finally at Silas, with the look of a man revising his understanding of a situation he thought he'd controlled. "You won't find a judge in this county who'll—" "I'm going to stop you there," Wynn said, "because you're about to say something that's going to sound worse in a courtroom than you want it to. Take your men. Ride back to town. Don't go anywhere you'd need a good reason to be. We'll be having a formal conversation later today, and you want to be findable for it." Voss didn't move for a long 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse. He rode out without another word, and his men went with him, and the sound of the hoofbeats receded back down the trail toward the north road, and then became distant, and then became nothing. Wynn kept his rifle out for another minute. He was the kind of man who put a weapon away when he was sure, not when the situation seemed to suggest he could. "You all right?" he said to both of them. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Silas." "Fine." He was watching the trail junction. "He's going to run." "Maybe," Wynn said, "but if he runs, that's its own kind of answer, and I've already wired ahead to the county." He put the rifle away at last. "He doesn't run. Men like that don't run. They lawyer up and dig in and try to manage the narrative, and this time the narrative has all the documentation it needs to survive the management." He patted the oilskin under his coat. "I'm going to ride hard for the county seat. You two get back to the ranch and stay there until I send word." "I have a shop to open," Evelyn said. Wynn looked at her. "Miss Hartwell, I've been threatened and followed and had my window broken, and I'm not closing my shop." She said it without heat, just fact. "I'll stay on Main Street where there's people, but I'm not hiding." He looked at her for a moment. "Stay visible," he said. "Stay where people can see you. Don't go anywhere alone until I get back." "Agreed." He rode out. They listened to him go, and then the basin was quiet again, and they stood between the two old cottonwoods with the fresh dug earth between the roots and the snow lying clean and thin on the basin floor around them. Silas exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale that carried more in it than air. "You should have stayed back," he said. But he said it without conviction, which meant he didn't mean it. "You keep saying things you don't mean," Evelyn said. "It's inefficient." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "I know." They rode back toward the ranch in a quiet that was different from the one they'd ridden out in. Heavier with what had happened, but lighter underneath that, in the way that a thing which has been feared for a long time is less terrible once it's arrived than it was in the waiting. The morning had come fully up by now, the sky going from gray to a pale, watery blue that wasn't quite warm but was trying. Halfway back, Silas said, "She wrote about you." Evelyn looked over at him. "Maeve? In the thinking book. Not you specifically. She wrote—" He kept his eyes on the trail. "She wrote that she hoped whoever came after her would be someone who saw what she saw in the land. Not just the surface of it. Someone who looked at things and asked what was underneath." He paused. "That's not exactly what she wrote, but that's the shape of it. How could she have written about me? She didn't. I just read it and thought of you." The horses moved beneath them. The trail wound through the juniper stand. "That's a generous thing to say," Evelyn said. "I'm not generous," he said. "I'm just accurate." She looked at him riding beside her in the morning light with his hat pulled against the wind and his coat mended at the shoulder and the thinking book inside his coat against his chest, and she thought about accuracy. She thought about a woman who'd buried the truth between two trees and trusted that the right moment would find it. She thought about what it takes to love someone that practically and that quietly, to think, "I won't be here to tell him, so I'll make it so the ground tells him instead." When they got back to the ranch, she built the fire in the cabin while Silas checked the horses, and she put the coffee on and sat at the table and waited. And he came in from the barn with his hat in his hands and snow on his shoulders, and stood in the doorway looking at the fire for a moment before he looked at her. "I should have come into the shop the first Friday," she said. He frowned slightly. What? Instead of the 4th or 5th or whenever it was, I finally said something. I should have just asked the first Friday. She looked at him. I kept waiting for the right moment. There is no such thing. You just have to ask. He stood in the doorway. You were operating a business, he said. You weren't supposed to interrogate the customers. I wasn't interrogating. I was asking. She gestured at the chair across from her because he was still in the doorway. Sit down. You've had a long morning. He sat. She poured the coffee and put his cup in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it in the way he always did, and they sat at Maeve's kitchen table with the fire going and the snow outside and the thinking book between them on the table where Silas had set it when he came in. He looked at it. You can read it, he said. If you want to. She'd have wanted it to matter to someone who could understand why it mattered. Are you sure? No, he said, which was honest, but I think yes. She picked it up carefully. The cover was soft with age and handling, and the pages had the particular texture of paper that's been written in many times over many years. She opened it to the first page, and Maeve Boone's handwriting was small and precise and slanted slightly to the right, the writing of someone who'd been told to control her letters and had controlled them and then forgotten to care about controlling them after a while, so that later entries had more give in them, more life. She read 3 pages before she stopped and looked at Silas. She loved this land, she said. I know she did. She wasn't protecting it as evidence, or not only that. She was protecting it because she thought it was beautiful and important and worth protecting for its own sake. Evelyn looked back at the book. The aquifer, the wildflowers, the creek. She wrote about them like they were something she'd been trusted with. Not owned, trusted with. Silas was very quiet. That's how she talked about most things, he said finally. Like they were loans. Like you didn't own beauty, you just got to be near it for a while. She was right about that too. He looked at his coffee cup. She was right about most things. The fire ticked. Outside, the light was improving. The kind of improvement that comes slowly in early spring and matters more because of it. Evelyn read more of the journal, and Silas drank his coffee, and the thinking book lay open on the table between them in the cabin where Maeve had put wildflowers in a jar every Friday, and neither of them felt the need to say anything about that. Until Silas said, quietly, what she put in that box. The surveys, the deeds, the ledger, is enough to protect this land permanently. Wynne will use it in the legal case, but once it's on record, it's a different thing. It's not just defended, it's known. He looked at the table. I'm not going to use the aquifer to get rich. That's not what this is. I know, Evelyn said. Other ranches in this valley have dried up during drought years. Families have sold out and left because they couldn't hold on. If that water is managed properly, accessed in a way that keeps it viable long term. You're thinking about a water rights trust, she said. Some kind of community access arrangement. He looked at her. Is that a real thing? It's a real thing. You'd need a lawyer who knows land and water law, and you'd need to set it up so no single person, including you, can unilaterally change the terms. Wynne might know who to talk to. He will. Silas nodded once, the sealing nod. She was learning to read those nods. This one meant decided. Then that's what we do with it. He picked up his coffee and she went back to reading the journal, and for the next hour the only sounds were the fire and the occasional wind and the pages turning. She was nearly to the end, the last entries, written in Maeve's hand with the slight unsteadiness that came into it near the finish. Letters still controlled, but showing the effort of control, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Single horse. Moving fast. They both looked at the door at the same time. Silas was up before she'd put the journal down, and at the window a half-second after that, and whatever he saw in the yard made his posture change in a way she'd learned to pay attention to. It's Wynne's deputy, he said. Pharaoh. He opened the door before Pharaoh could knock. The deputy was young, sharp-faced, and currently breathing like a man who'd ridden fast and had something to say that he'd been rehearsing on the way over. Voss is gone, Pharaoh said. He went to his house after he left the basin, sent his houseman out with a message I think was meant to look like a regular errand, but Carlyle at the telegraph office says there was a wire sent to Billings about 40 minutes ago. Voss's buggy is gone from his property. His account at the bank had a large withdrawal this morning, first thing. Silas looked past Pharaoh at the road. He's running, he said. Sheriff Wynne thought you should know right away. He sent wires to Billings and the county seat before he left this morning, just in case. But he's not back yet. Pharaoh's expression carried the specific tension of a young deputy who'd been left holding a situation that had moved faster than anticipated. He said to tell you to stay put and let the law handle it. Evelyn stood in the doorway behind Silas. And the documents? The evidence is with Wynne? Yes, ma'am, he's got it. Then Voss running is exactly what Wynne said it would be, she said. Its own kind of answer. Silas turned back from the road. He had the look she'd first seen at the cemetery, the level, braced look, but something underneath it was different now, less like a man absorbing punishment and more like a man who'd found his footing. All right, he said to Pharaoh, tell Wynne I'll be here when he gets back. Pharaoh nodded and rode out. Silas came back inside and stood in the front room for a moment, and Evelyn watched him work through whatever he was working through. He went to the window and stood looking out at the north ridge. The morning light was on it now, and she could see from where she stood the dark line of the cottonwood stand against the pale sky far up in the basin. She put all of that up there, he said, because she knew someone might need it someday. She didn't know when or who. She just trusted that if she did the right thing, the moment would find it. He was quiet for a moment. I spent 5 years being angry at the world for taking her. I never thought about everything she left behind on purpose. Evelyn came and stood beside him at the window. She left you too, she said. That was on purpose. He looked at her. The ranch, the land, the fact that you stayed. She looked out at the ridge. She knew you well enough to know you wouldn't leave. She was counting on it. His jaw worked. She was very smart, Evelyn said. Yeah, he said. She was. They stood at the window and looked at the north ridge, and the light moved across it the way morning light moves across high country, slowly, like it's not in any hurry to get anywhere, like it knows it has the whole day. Outside, somewhere on the ridge between the two old cottonwoods, the ground was still open where they'd dug, and the iron box sat empty in the roots, and the spring, deep beneath all that rock and thin soil, moved the way underground water moves, without reference to the surface, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to whatever the people above it were doing what it had always done, which was hold. Voss was found in Billings 3 days later. He hadn't made it far, which Wynne said was typical. Men who'd spent a decade being careful tended to panic badly when the carefulness stopped working, and panic made you visible. He'd checked into a hotel under his own name, which told you something about the relationship between arrogance and good judgment. The Billings Sheriff's Office held him on Wynne's wire, and the extradition paperwork went through the county court without significant resistance, because Judge Harlow had looked at the documents from Maeve's iron box and used the word unconscionable twice in the same paragraph, which in judicial language was roughly equivalent to fury. Wynne rode back into Red Willow on a Thursday with Voss in a wagon behind him and a deputy on either side, and the town came out to watch in the way small towns do when something they've suspected for a long time finally arranges itself into visible form. People stood on the boardwalks and said very little, because what was happening in front of them was the kind of thing that didn't need commentary. The cattle broker who told half the valley what to do with their land for 20 years sat in the back of a wagon with his hands in front of him and looked at the faces of the people he'd maneuvered and pressured and waited out, and none of them looked away first. Silas was not among them. He heard about it from Evelyn, who'd been in the shop when the wagon came down Main Street and had watched from the doorway with the measured calm of a woman who'd decided to feel whatever she felt about it privately. She rode out to Black Ridge that afternoon and told him, and he listened at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold in front of him and didn't say much. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, which was what he did when she asked him direct questions. "Smaller than I expected," he said. "The whole thing, watching it come apart, I thought it would feel like more." "It never does," she said. "It just feels like the next morning." He looked at her. "That's exactly what it feels like." The legal proceedings moved at the pace legal proceedings move, which is to say slowly and with considerable paperwork. Harlan Creed, Voss's land agent out of Billings, made the decision that people in his position reliably make when the alternative is taking the full weight of someone else's scheme. He talked. He talked at length and in detail with the particular thoroughness of a man who'd been waiting for permission to unburden himself for about 11 years. The broken window, the threatening note, the barn fire, that one had been Creed's doing, physically, with a lantern from Voss's own supply shed, which was the kind of operational sloppiness that happens when a patient plan runs out of patience. The journal theft had been Cutter, the hand with the lame left hand, who had come through the front door of the cabin while Silas and Evelyn were in the barn pulling horses from the smoke. He'd taken only the thinking book because Creed had told him what to look for, and Creed had known what to look for because Voss had been watching Maeve's movements in the last year of her life more closely than Silas had understood at the time. That part landed hard. Silas sat with it for a day, and then he came to the shop on a morning that wasn't Friday and stood at the counter and said he was watching her before she died. She knew someone was watching the land and she tried to protect it, and I didn't... He stopped. You didn't know, Evelyn said. I wasn't paying enough attention. He said it without self-pity, just the flat assessment of a man holding himself to account. I was busy with the ranch, with the cattle prices, with all the practical things that felt urgent, and she was up in the North Basin documenting a scheme by herself because she didn't want to worry me. She made that choice. It was hers to make. I know. He looked at the counter. I just wish she'd had someone watching her back the way she was watching everything else. Evelyn looked at him across the counter. She did, she said. Eventually. He looked up. You're here, she said. Doing what she spent years trying to make possible. That counts, Silas. It counts in a way that isn't diminished by the timing. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm going to set up a water access trust. Wynn gave me the name of a lawyer out of Cheyenne who handles land and water cases. I'm riding down there next week. Good. It'll take time to set up, and money I don't have a lot of. What do you have? Enough to start it, and once the legal case settles, there may be restitution for the barn damage and the property interference. Wynn thinks so. Evelyn nodded. She'd been thinking about her own finances with the particular focus that gets applied to problems when you've stopped pretending they might resolve themselves. The loan note was still real. The ledger was still telling her unpleasant things. Voss's offer was gone, which was fine. She'd never wanted what came attached to it. But the underlying problem it had been a response to hadn't changed. I got a letter this week, she said. Silas waited. From a horticultural company in Denver. I'd applied for a training program they run. 4 months, specialized study in nursery management and botanical cultivation, with supply contracts available at the end for shops that complete it. She looked at the work table. I applied 8 months ago and didn't hear back, and then I forgot I'd applied, and now they've offered me a place in the autumn cohort. That's good news, he said. Careful. Reading the situation. It is. She smoothed the edge of the work table with her thumb, a small motion she made when she was working through something. It would change the shop significantly. The debt would be restructured as part of the program. They have an arrangement with the County Agricultural Bank, and the supply relationships would mean I could price competitively against Callaway without undercutting quality. But it's 4 months in Denver. The word Denver sat in the air between them. She looked at him. He was holding his expression very carefully, and the way she'd learned meant he was deciding what to do with his face rather than what to do with his feelings, because he already knew what he felt and was working on whether to say it. When do you need to answer them? He said. 2 weeks. He nodded. Didn't say anything else. She wanted to be angry at him for the silence, except she understood the silence. He wasn't going to tell her what to do with her own life. He'd been on the receiving end of that particular problem. People making decisions about what was good for him, what he could handle, what he needed, and he wasn't going to turn it around and point it at her. It was one of the things she'd come to understand about him that she couldn't have predicted at the beginning. His restraint was a form of respect, not absence. Say something useful, she said. He looked at the counter for a moment, then he said, What does the shop need most? Capital, connections, techniques I don't have yet because I've been running a struggling shop alone since I was 22, and I've mostly been learning by failing and correcting. And the program gives you all of that. Yes. Then the program is what the shop needs. I didn't ask what the shop needs, she said. I said say something useful. He met her eyes. I know what you're asking. I don't think I should answer it. Why not? Because the last time someone made a decision for you based on what they thought you should do, it was Voss, and you told him to go to hell. He said it simply, without drama. I'm not going to be a version of that with better intentions. She looked at him for a long moment. You're frustrating, she said. Yeah. He almost smiled. I've heard that. She turned back to the work table because she needed something to do with her hands. She had flowers to prep, a fresh delivery that morning, actually decent quality for once. And she started sorting them by stem length with more focus than the task required. If I go, she said without turning around, I'll be back in December. I know. The shop will need someone to water the overwintering stock. I can do that. You'll have to come into town. I come into town every Friday anyway. She turned around. Do you understand what I'm not saying? He looked at her with the particular steadiness that meant yes, He understood precisely what she wasn't saying, and he'd been sitting with it for the duration of this conversation and possibly longer. "Evelyn," he said, "go to Denver. Do the program. Come back in December and tell me everything you learned." He paused. "I'll be here." She looked at him, standing at her counter in his mended coat with his hat in his hands, which was where his hat always was when he was being serious, and she thought about the first time she'd asked him a question and how still he'd gone before he answered. And she thought about walking up the hill to a cemetery and standing beside 2 headstones in the wind. And she thought about coffee at 4 a.m. and checking the doors in the dark, and a woman who'd buried the truth between 2 trees and trusted the right moment would come. "All right," she said. She wrote to Denver that evening and accepted the place in the autumn cohort, and the next morning she felt simultaneously certain she'd made the right decision and vaguely terrified, which was probably the correct combination of feelings for a decision of that size. The weeks between the letter and the departure were busy in the way that weeks before a big change are always busy. Every ordinary task acquiring a slight extra significance, the sense of cataloging what you're leaving so you have it accurately in your head when you're gone. She organized the shop's inventory. She arranged for Mrs. Pell's nephew, who was reliable and not too conversational, to open and close 3 days a week and water the stock. She wrote out instructions for everything she could think of, and then wrote out instructions for the things she'd forgotten. She also spent more time at Black Ridge than she had before, for no reason she was fully ready to name, but that Silas seemed to understand without being told. They worked on the barn repair together. He'd gotten the timber, and she'd held things while he built, which was not glamorous work, but had the quality of useful shared time that she'd come to prefer over other kinds. The barn wall was solid by mid-May, better than before in the specific way that repaired things sometimes are, because you know where the weak point was, and you've made it the strongest part. One evening, she was in the barn brushing the gray while Silas mended tack at the work table, and she said without particular preamble, "What was she like when she laughed?" He looked up from the leather in his hands. He didn't ask who she meant. "Surprised," he said. That was the thing about it. She laughed like she hadn't seen it coming, like something had snuck up on her. He turned the bridle over. She was serious most of the time. Thoughtful, I mean. She took things seriously, and then something would catch her off guard and she'd laugh and she'd look genuinely startled by it. He paused. "June used to do it too. In the few months we had her. She'd look surprised by everything good." Evelyn brushed the gray's flank and didn't say anything, because this was the kind of thing that didn't need a response, just reception. "I stopped letting things surprise me," he said. "After. It felt safer. If you didn't let things catch you off guard, good things, I mean, then nothing could take them from you unexpectedly." "Does it feel that way now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Not as much," he said. "Since February." Since February. Since she'd asked him a question across a wooden counter and he'd gone completely still before he answered. "Good," she said. "That's good, Silas." He went back to the tack. She went back to the gray. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horse and the particular mineral scent of the oil he used on the leather, and outside the May evening was going amber and long, and neither of them felt the need to make it into something it wasn't. The week before Evelyn was due to leave, Red Willow had what amounted to a collective reckoning with itself. It started with a town meeting Wynne convened to explain the water rights situation and what Silas intended to do with the aquifer, the trust structure, the community access provisions, the terms that would prevent any single owner or buyer from monopolizing the water in future. Wynne presented it in plain language, which was the only language he trusted for important things. And the room was quiet in the way rooms are when people are listening rather than waiting to talk. Afterward, Dan Proctor, who ran the Proctor Ranch on the valley's east side and had nearly sold out the previous summer when his wells dropped, stood up and said, "I want to understand. You're saying this water's been under Black Ridge the whole time, and Boone's going to make sure we can access it in a drought year. Not sell it, not use it as leverage, just access it." "That's what I'm saying," Wynne said. Proctor sat down. He looked at his hat in his hands. His wife knew about it. "She did." The room was quiet again. "She kept it safe," Proctor said. "She did." What happened after that meeting was harder to describe than it was to observe. It was more of a shift than an event, a gradual reorientation of the way the town looked at things it had been looking at for a while without fully seeing. People had watched Silas Boone come into Red Willow every Friday for 5 years and buy flowers and go home, and they'd understood that as grief, which it was, but they hadn't understood what else it was. It was also consistency. Faithfulness to something beyond what the world owed him. Showing up when showing up cost you something. He'd done that for 5 years without any audience. Turns out that matters to people when they find out about it. Mabel Archer at the dry goods store, who'd been frostily polite to Silas for years, came to the flower shop and bought a plant she didn't need and told Evelyn she thought Black Ridge Ranch was a credit to the valley. Mrs. Pell stopped wrapping her concern in careful language and just said, outright, that she thought Evelyn had more sense than she'd been given credit for. Dottie Marsh, who'd been the town's primary observer for 30 years, said nothing at all, which from Dottie was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Silas himself seemed not to notice most of this, or noticed it and filed it in a category he didn't find particularly relevant. He came to town on the usual Friday, bought the usual flowers, lavender in the bouquet now as a matter of course, Evelyn had stopped even remarking on it, and they walked up the hill together, and at the top he stood beside the 2 stones for the usual stretch of quiet, and when they walked back down, he said, Proctor came out to the ranch yesterday. He wants to understand how the trust will work, what his rights are under it. What did you tell him? That I didn't have all the answers yet, that the Cheyenne lawyer is still drawing it up, but that the principle was simple. Access in drought years for established ranches in the valley, managed draw rights, no single party controlling the whole thing. How did he take it? He shook my hand. Silas said this with the mild bewilderment of a man who'd expected the world to behave a certain way for long enough that it startled him when it didn't. Stayed for coffee. He's a good rancher, knows his soil. Evelyn looked at him sideways. People have always wanted to think well of you, she said. You just didn't make it easy. I wasn't trying to make it hard. I know. That's what made it hard. He seemed to find this unreasonably logical. The last week went quickly, in the way that last weeks do, when you've committed to something that's going to change the shape of your life, and the date is arriving whether you're ready or not. She packed what she needed, left the shop in Mrs. Pell's nephew's trustworthy hands, wrote out every instruction she could think of twice, and arrived at the stage office on a Tuesday morning in early September with a trunk and a bag and the feeling of standing on the edge of something she'd put off for too long. Silas was there. She hadn't told him the specific time. He'd apparently asked the stage office. He had a bouquet. Not the regular Friday flowers. Something more considered, put together with a care that she recognized as unusual for a man who generally chose practicality over presentation. Wild flowers, lavender, and 1 white prairie rose at the center, wrapped in the plain brown twine she used herself. She looked at the rose. That's not from the shop, she said. No. Found it in the North Basin this morning. They grow along the dry creek bed. He held the bouquet out to her. First time I've seen one up there. They weren't there last summer. She took the flowers. The rose was small and wild-shaped, not the round, cultivated roses she sold in the shop, but that was what made it what it was. You went up to the basin this morning, she said. I go up there now. He said it simply. I wanted to see what was growing. She looked at him standing on the stage off his boardwalk in the early September morning with his hat in his hands, which was where it always was. There were people around. Dottie at the post office, a couple of ranch hands loading a wagon down the street, Mrs. Pell coming out of the bakery across the way with a paper package under her arm and pretending not to watch. He was aware of all of them and not performing for any of them, which was entirely characteristic. Thank you, she said, for the flowers. They're not for grief, he said. These ones, in case that's not clear. It's clear. All right. He looked at the stage office door. 4 months. 4 months. I'll have the water trust structure finalized by December. The lawyer's confident about the timeline. You can tell me about it when I get back. I'll have a lot to tell you. I'll want to hear it. The stage was coming down the street. She could hear it before she saw it, the particular sound of 6 horses on packed ground. Around them, the town was doing its morning business, and the September light was still warm enough to feel like summer's last argument, and she had wildflowers in her hand with a prairie rose at the center that had come from a dry creek bed over an underground spring. She kissed him. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where the moment swells to fill itself. It was a brief, deliberate press of her lips against the corner of his jaw because she'd overestimated her own composure slightly and adjusted in transit, and then she stepped back and looked at him while the stage pulled up behind her. He looked like a man who'd been handed something he hadn't quite believed he was going to be handed, which was the most human she'd ever seen him look. I'll be here, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm going. She meant it the way it was true. She could go, because there was something worth coming back to. That was a different thing than going without tether, which she'd been doing for the 4 years she'd run the shop alone, treading water toward no particular shore. Now there was a shore. She could swim properly. She climbed into the stage. The door closed. Through the window, she could see him standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, and then the stage moved and he got smaller, and then the bend in the road took him. And she was looking at open country and the long road south. She put the bouquet in her lap carefully, the prairie rose facing up, and thought about 4 months and what she intended to do with them. She was going to learn everything the Denver program could teach her and several things it couldn't. She was going to ask every question she'd been too busy surviving to ask, and she was going to come back to Red Willow with the kind of knowledge that made a struggling shop into something that lasted. She was going to do all of that because the shop was hers and had been her mother's before her and was worth saving, not because someone else needed it to survive, but because it was good work and she was good at it, and those two things together were more than enough reason. And she was going to come back in December to a town that had revised its understanding of itself, and a water trust being drawn up in Cheyenne, and a man who checked the doors in the dark and got up at 4 a.m. to make coffee and went to the North Basin now to see what was growing. Behind her, Red Willow receded into the Wyoming distance. Ahead, the road went south through the long autumn light. She held the flowers. In town, Silas stood on the boardwalk until the stage was gone, and then he put his hat on and stood a moment longer, and Dottie from the post office said something across the street that he didn't catch. He raised a hand in acknowledgement of whatever it was. Then he walked down to the livery, got his horse, and rode back to Black Ridge. There was fence to mend in the west pasture, and the water trust documents needed another review before he sent his comments to the Cheyenne lawyer, and he wanted to go back up to the North Basin before the light failed to see if there were more prairie roses along the creek bed, because that seemed like information worth having. He had 4 months. He intended to use them. December came into Red Willow the way it always did, without apology, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in a single night and leaving the town to sort itself out around the new reality. The first hard frost killed what was left in the window boxes along Main Street, and the sky went the particular flat white of Wyoming winter that meant business rather than weather. Silas noticed all of it and noted none of it because he was watching the south road. The stage from Cheyenne came through on Tuesdays and Fridays. He'd known that for years without it mattering. Now he knew which Fridays fell in December and had arranged to be in town on all of them without telling anyone that was what he was doing, because there was no version of explaining it that didn't make him sound like a man who'd lost his grip on ordinary composure, which was more or less accurate. The first Friday in December, the stage was late and carried 3 passengers, none of them Evelyn. He rode back to Black Ridge and checked the fence line in the west pasture and did not think about it more than necessary. The second Friday, she came. He was at the livery dropping off his horse when he heard the stage come around the south bend, and he came out to the street in time to see it pull up in front of the stage office and the door open, and Evelyn Hartwell stepped down onto the boardwalk with a trunk and a bag and a leather case he hadn't seen before, and she looked different in a way that was also entirely the same. She was wearing a coat he didn't recognize, a deep green wool that suited the December light, and her hair was pinned differently, and she carried herself with the particular posture of someone who'd spent 4 months being taken seriously and had adjusted to it. She saw him standing in the street. She said, "You're here." "I come into town on Fridays," he said. "You do." She smiled, and it was the real smile, not the professional one she used in the shop when she was being pleasant for customers. "Help me with the trunk." He helped with the trunk. They walked to the shop together while Dottie at the post office watched with the transparent discretion of a woman who'd been observing this town for 40 years and had no intention of missing a detail now. Mrs. Pell's nephew had kept the shop alive in Evelyn's absence. The overwintering stock was intact, the space was clean, the ledger updated in a handwriting that was careful, if not elegant. Evelyn walked through it with her coat still on, checking things in the quick, comprehensive way of a person who knows a space down to its bones and can read it the way other people read text. "He did all right," she said. "He came when he said he would," Silas said from the doorway. "I checked." She looked at him. "You checked. I was in town on Fridays anyway." She set the leather case on the work table and opened it, and inside were seed packets and small labeled envelopes and a fold of papers with a Denver letterhead that turned out to be the supply contracts she'd mentioned. 3 of them, with wholesalers who dealt in cultivated stock she'd never had access to before, priced in a way that finally made the numbers in the ledger say something other than slow disaster. "The debt's restructured," she said, setting the papers aside. "The agricultural bank signed off on the new terms 2 weeks ago. The program arranged it like they said they would." She paused, looking at the contracts. "I'm not out of trouble, but I can see the other side of trouble from here, which is different from where I was in February." "What else did you learn?" he said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway still, which was where he tended to stand. At the edge of spaces, not the center. 4 months hadn't changed that. She was glad it hadn't changed that. Everything she said. Propagation techniques I didn't know existed. Cold storage methods that'll let me carry better stock through Wyoming winters. A grafting approach for the native roses that I want to try in the North Basin. She stopped. I want to try something with the wildflower varieties up there, actually. The soil conditions from the aquifer, the moisture distribution, might support cultivated native species I couldn't grow in ordinary conditions. I've been thinking about it since October. He was looking at her with the expression she'd cataloged over the preceding months from memory. The level, attentive look that meant he was listening with his full attention, not the polite, partial attention most people offered. I talked to the lawyer in October, he said. The trust documents were filed with the county court in November. It's done. She stopped. Done. Fully? Fully. 7 ranches in the valley signed on as beneficiary rights holders. Wynn filed the water protection covenant alongside the trust, so it's on permanent record. Any attempt to sell or transfer the aquifer rights has to go through the trust committee, which is the rights holders, which means no single person can ever buy their way to control of it. He paused. Proctor cried. I didn't know what to do with that. You didn't need to do anything with it, she said. I know. I still didn't know what to do with it. He looked at the doorframe. His wife sent a pie to the ranch. I don't know what the protocol is for that. You eat it and write a thank you note. I ate it. I didn't write the note. I'll help you write the note. He looked at her. Something in him had shifted in 4 months. Not the fundamental quality of him, which was unchanged, but the frequency of these small, near smiles that weren't quite smiles. She'd been afraid that time and distance would have settled him back into the more sealed version of himself, the one that had operated alone for 5 years and gotten used to it. It hadn't. He'd been working on something while she was gone, and the working showed. Voss, she said. What happened at the county court? Silas leaned against the doorframe. The formal proceedings finished last month. Creed's testimony held up. All of it. The arson charge, the property interference, the fraudulent survey suppression. Voss's lawyers tried to argue the survey acquisition was private business research with no criminal intent, and Harlow shut it down in about 20 minutes. He paused. He's looking at 2 years. Maybe more, depending on how the restitution proceedings go. The restitution. For the barn, the broken window, the stolen journal. He said the last one with a flatness that wasn't quite anger, but lived next to it. The journal's gone. Creed said Voss had it destroyed once he realized it documented the approach to Maeve before the marriage, but the record of it exists in Creed's testimony and in Maeve's other journals, which I gave copies of to Wynn. He looked out the shop window at the December street. He can't take back what he took, but it's on the public record now, what he did and why. That matters to me. It should, Evelyn said. It's the truth. It belongs somewhere. People can find it. He nodded. She looked at him for a moment. Are you all right? And don't tell me fine. He considered that, with the seriousness he brought to direct questions from her. Better than I was in September, he said. I've been going up to the North Basin more often. I found 3 more prairie roses along the creek bed in October, before the frost. I took the time to map where the wildflowers grew thickest this past season, for your idea about the cultivated natives. She hadn't told him about that idea until 20 minutes ago. You mapped the wildflower distribution in the North Basin, she said slowly, for an idea I hadn't told you yet. I thought you'd probably have an idea along those lines. He looked at the ceiling briefly, which was his version of a shrug. You'd been thinking about the aquifer's effect on soil moisture since April. It wasn't hard to extrapolate. She looked at him across the work table. Silas. Yes. I missed you. He looked back at her. I know, he said. I missed you too. I thought about telling you in a letter, but I didn't know how to write it without it sounding like a person who missed someone. I was going to say maudlin. Same thing. The corner of his mouth moved. Not exactly. They opened the shop the following Monday, and by the end of the first week, it was clear that something had changed in the way red willow related to juniper and stem. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens when a town revises its understanding of what something is and adjusts its behavior accordingly, usually without acknowledging it directly. More people came in who hadn't come before. A rancher from the valley's north end stopped in to ask about planting cover crops for soil stabilization, which was a horticultural question she hadn't been asked before and could now answer properly. 2 women who'd previously bought their cut flowers from the Callaway catalog in Harrington switched their accounts. The shop wasn't suddenly thriving. It was a flower shop in a Wyoming town in December, which set a ceiling on things. But the tide had turned, and turning tides are perceptible even when they're gradual. Evelyn noticed all of it. She also noticed that on Fridays at 3, Silas came in and she had the lavender already in the bouquet, and they walked up the hill, and the December ground was hard under their boots, but the path was familiar enough now that it didn't matter. The second Friday of December was the one she'd remember. The sky had cleared overnight after 3 days of low clouds, and the cold had sharpened into the kind of clean, bright cold that makes the world look precise and well-defined. At the cemetery, their breath made clouds in the air, and the 2 headstones had a thin crust of frost that caught the afternoon light. Silas crouched and put the flowers down as he always did, and he was quiet for the usual stretch that she'd learned to hold space for without filling. She stood slightly behind him and looked at Maeve's name and the dates beneath it, and thought, as she often did up here, about the thinking book. About a woman who'd mapped an aquifer in her head and buried the proof between 2 trees and sung a rhyme to her infant daughter that was also a set of directions. And done all of it quietly and without asking for anything back. The world was full of that kind of person. People who did careful, important things that nobody saw, and didn't do them for the seeing. Evelyn had spent 4 months in Denver around accomplished, credentialed people who knew how to make their competence visible, and it had been valuable, genuinely valuable. But it had also reminded her of what she already knew. The most important work was usually done quietly, by people who had decided that the work was the point and the recognition was beside it. Maeve Boone had known that, had lived it so completely that she'd kept a whole valley's water future safe from a man who'd spent 11 years trying to steal it, and done it alone, in a thinking book, buried in the ground. Silas stood. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right." He turned, which was not his usual posture at the grave. He usually faced the stones until he was ready to go, and going was the signal that they could talk. The fact that he turned while still at the grave meant whatever he was going to say was connected to this place in a way he wanted acknowledged. "I told Maeve about you," he said. "Last month. I come up here and I usually just stand. I don't talk, but in November I told her about you, about the shop and Denver and the water trust. About February and the question you asked me about the flowers." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what I believe about where people go, but I know that standing up here and saying it out loud made it feel settled in a way it hadn't before." Evelyn looked at him. "I told her I wasn't forgetting her," he said. "I needed her to know that wasn't what this was. And I told her that if she could have chosen someone for me, the kind of woman she'd have respected, who'd have done right by this land and this life, I think she'd have chosen something like you." The wind came across the cemetery, quiet and cold and directionless. "I'm not trying to replace what's here," he said. "I just needed to stand up here and say that out loud, with both of them, before I said anything else anywhere else." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "I know you do." "Silas." "Yes." She looked at him in the winter light with Maeve's name behind him and the valley visible beyond the cemetery fence, bare and immense and specific in the way it was specific in the cold, when the detail of the land came up sharp and clear. "Ask me what you came up here to ask me." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Come to Black Ridge, not as a guest, not for a visit." He stopped, and she could see him pushing past the part of himself that found this difficult. "Build it with me, whatever it becomes." It wasn't formal. It wasn't the kind of declaration that appeared in novels with speeches and elaborate sentiment. It was a man who'd been alone for 5 years asking her to stop being at a distance, and he was asking it at a graveside with frost on the stones and the valley wind in their faces and no audience except the 2 people buried there, which was exactly the right place to ask it, she thought. He'd made his peace here first and then asked her, which was the only order that was honest. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Long, slow, like setting something down. "All right," he said. They walked back down the hill. They were married in October of the following year, on a clear morning that smelled of turned earth and the last of the autumn wildflowers, in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Wynne as witness and Mrs. Pell in the front row weeping in the openly satisfied way of someone whose judgment has been publicly vindicated. Dan Proctor came with his wife and shook Silas's hand for a long time without saying much, and Evelyn's Denver contacts sent flowers that arrived in pristine condition because the new supply chain actually worked, and Dottie Marsh said it was the best thing that had happened in Red Willow in 20 years, which everyone agreed was the highest possible form of endorsement. The shop became what Evelyn had seen it could be, slowly and with the ordinary difficulties that attend any real thing growing into its proper size. The supply contracts from Denver held. The native plant program she developed for the North Basin, working with the particular moisture conditions created by the aquifer's influence on the upper soil, produced wildflower varieties that the valley hadn't seen in cultivated form before, and the first season's results attracted attention from a horticultural society in Cheyenne that eventually published a small monograph about it, with Evelyn's name on the cover in print she looked at twice before she believed it. The water trust functioned as it was designed to function, which meant it functioned almost invisibly. The best infrastructure always does. The summer 3 years after the trust was formalized was the driest in 20 years, and 6 of the 7 beneficiary ranches drew on their access rights and came through the season without selling out. Proctor's was the 7th, and he didn't need to draw because he'd redesigned his irrigation based on the trust's technical recommendations, which had come from a report Evelyn helped compile using her horticultural knowledge of water-efficient native planting. She thought about Maeve sometimes when she was working on things like that. About a woman she'd never met who had decided that what she knew was worth protecting and had gone ahead and protected it in the best way available to her. There was something in that she tried to hold on to. The idea that the work you do quietly, without an audience, without certainty that it will matter, is often exactly the work that ends up mattering most. Not always. Life doesn't guarantee outcomes. But the consistency of honest effort made in the direction of something genuinely worth preserving, that had a way of finding its moment. Silas went to the North Basin regularly. He kept mapping the wildflower distribution, updating his records each season, tracking the changes in species diversity as the aquifer's influence extended through the soil. It was not what a rancher's work usually looked like, and he was aware of that. But he found that he'd become the kind of person who mapped things. He found beautiful because what else were you supposed to do with beauty you'd been trusted with? He told Evelyn about each season's changes with the detailed enthusiasm of a man who'd been too quiet for too long and was making up for it in increments, and she listened with genuine interest because it was genuinely interesting. And also because listening to him talk about the land was one of her favorite things, which she didn't tell him because he already had enough information to make him insufferable on the subject. Their children came the way children come, with a combination of joy and alarm and the immediate renegotiation of everything you thought you understood about your own capacity for love and exhaustion. A boy first, Thomas, named for Evelyn's father and notable from early on for the particular combination of his mother's stubbornness and his father's stillness, which was going to be very effective or very troublesome depending on how it developed. A girl 2 years later, small and precise and curious about everything she encountered, who would spend her entire childhood taking things apart to understand how they worked. They named her June. Silas had asked Evelyn about it carefully, wanting to be sure it was what she wanted and not what she felt obligated to. She'd said yes without hesitation, which was how she said most important things. There was enough love in the world for a name to mean more than one thing. That was not a complication. That was the point. They brought both children to the cemetery from the time they were old enough to walk the hill, because Silas had decided early that the past was not a thing to be managed or minimized, but a thing to be introduced properly. He talked about Maeve and June the way you talk about people who are part of the family's fabric, specifically, without ceremony, with the small particular details that make a person real rather than symbolic. Maeve had laughed like she was surprised by it. She'd put wildflowers on the table every Friday because she believed flowers in a house meant someone was paying attention. She'd been right about almost everything. She'd kept a thinking book. June had been 9 months old and had looked surprised by everything good. Thomas listened to all of this with the focused solemnity of a child who understood that he was being given something important. Their daughter, the younger June, had a different way of processing information, which was to act on it immediately. The first time she heard about the tin box and the cottonwood roots, she wanted to go find it the same afternoon. One Friday, when Thomas was 7 and his sister was 5, they climbed the hill as they usually did, and Silas and Evelyn let the children run ahead as they usually did, carrying the bouquets with the self-importance of children trusted with something fragile. Thomas was careful with his. June ran. At the grave, they put the flowers down the way they'd been taught. Thomas straightened his against the stone with the same deliberateness his father had and stood back. June set hers down and then looked at the second stone for a long time. Was she our family? Thomas asked. Silas crouched beside him. She still is, he said. Thomas thought about this with the seriousness he brought to large questions. He looked at his father's face. He looked at the stone. Then she should have a yellow one, he said. Yellow ones are good. He reached into the bouquet he was holding and found the best yellow wildflower, a coneflower still bright despite the walk up the hill, and placed it against the smaller stone. June watched him do this, and then she looked at Evelyn. "Mama," she said, "did she like wildflowers?" "She loved them," Evelyn said. "She used to put them in a jar on the kitchen table every Friday. She said flowers in a house meant someone was paying attention." June absorbed this. She looked at the flowers in her arms. She looked at the stone. "We're paying attention," she said, with the pragmatic certainty of a 5-year-old who has identified the correct response. "We are," Evelyn said. Silas stood. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at his daughter's small face with the expression that he still couldn't always control, the one where the level steadiness gave way to something undefended and clear. Evelyn slipped her hand into his. He held it. They stood at the top of the hill with their children at the stones and the valley below them going amber in the Friday afternoon light, and Evelyn thought about the long, complicated shape of a life and how different it looks from the inside than it does from any external description. From the outside, it could be told as a story about a water scheme and a man's grief and a woman who asked one question. And those things were all true. But from the inside, from where she was standing, it was a story about what it costs to keep showing up for something when showing up doesn't seem to be doing anything. 5 years of Fridays that looked like grief and were also faithfulness. A woman who buried the truth and trusted the right moment. A florist who asked a question because she was tired and the moment arrived before she could stop it. There is a thing about love that the stories get wrong, or at least incomplete. They tend to position it as a destination, the place you arrive at after the obstacles are cleared. But it isn't a destination. It's more like a practice, the way a craft is a practice, or the way tending a garden is a practice. You don't finish it. You do it again tomorrow with the same attention you brought today, and the day's work changes the soil so that tomorrow's work is possible. Some of what you plant takes years to surface. Some of it gets buried in iron boxes between tree roots and waits for a different season entirely. Silas Boone had learned this slowly and at a cost he'd never minimize. Evelyn Hartwell had known a version of it from watching her mother run a flower shop on the edge of failing for 20 years and never once treating the work as less than worth doing. Their children were learning it in the natural way children learn things that are lived around them rather than taught. And Maeve, who had sung directions like a lullaby and written the truth in a thinking book and trusted the earth to hold what she couldn't carry anymore, had known it all along. The wind came up from the valley in the way it always did at this hour on the hill, pushing through them from behind like something trying to get past. "Can we go see the cottonwoods?" June asked. Silas looked at Evelyn. "Next time," Evelyn said, "we'll make a day of it." "With the horses?" "With the horses." June accepted this with the pragmatism she brought to most negotiations. Thomas was still looking at the small stone where he'd put his yellow wildflower. "Papa," he said, "did she know she'd still be family?" Silas crouched beside him again. He thought about that question for a real moment, the way it deserved. "I think her mother did," he said. "I think her mother knew exactly what she was leaving and trusted it would find the people it was meant for." Thomas considered that. "That's good thinking," he said. "It was very good thinking," Silas said. "She was good at it." They walked down the hill in the failing Friday light, the children ahead and Silas and Evelyn behind. And the flowers they'd brought were bright against the gray stone at the top of the hill, and the valley below them was very large and very specific and entirely itself, the way the valley had always been and would be long after any of them. That night, after supper and after the children were in bed, Evelyn sat at Maeve's kitchen table, her table now, and Maeve's, in the way that tables accumulate the weight of everyone who's ever sat at them, and wrote her reply to the Cheyenne Horticultural Society about the next phase of the North Basin native plant documentation. Silas was on the other side of the table reading the ranch supply ledger, which was the kind of document that required the same careful attention as any other record of things that mattered. The fire was going, the lamp was on. Outside, the Wyoming dark was total and cold and entirely indifferent to whatever was happening inside the warm room, the way dark always is. At some point, he looked up from the ledger. "Thank you," he said. She looked up. "For what?" "Asking," he said. "That first Friday, you asked the question." She looked at him across the table. "You would have kept buying flowers," she said. "I would have kept tying them. Eventually someone would have asked." "I don't think so," he said. "I think it was you." She thought about that. About 3 years of Fridays that she'd watched without acting on, and the afternoon she'd been tired and the question had come out before she could stop it. It hadn't been courage, it hadn't been insight. It had been exhaustion and an unguarded moment, and the slightly terrifying honesty that sometimes fills the space when you're too worn down to manage your own impulses. But maybe that was what most important moments were, when you looked at them honestly. Not the grand gestures, not the carefully prepared declarations, but the unguarded seconds when the thing you actually meant got out before you could dress it up or hold it back. She'd asked one question, and here they were. "All right," she said. "You're welcome." He went back to the ledger. She went back to the letter. And in the North Basin, beneath the old cottonwoods whose roots still touched the hollow, where an iron box had waited 9 years for the right moment, the water moved through the dark earth the way it always had. Deep, patient, enormous, entirely untouched by the surface and everything that happened on it, doing only what it had always done, which was hold. Evelyn sent the letter to the Cheyenne Horticultural Society the following morning, and by spring the second phase of the North Basin documentation was underway, this time with 2 research assistants from the Society's own staff who rode out to Black Ridge on a Tuesday in April and stood between the old cottonwoods looking at the wildflower distribution maps Silas had kept for 3 seasons with the particular expression of people encountering work they hadn't expected to be as thorough as it was. "You did this yourself?" one of them asked Silas. "My wife told me what to measure," he said. "I just measured it." Evelyn, standing 10 feet away pretending to examine a soil sample, did not look up. The research took the better part of 2 seasons, and what it produced was more significant than anyone had anticipated when they'd started. The aquifer's influence on the North Basin's soil created conditions that allowed native wildflower varieties to establish and hold in ways that weren't replicable in ordinary Wyoming terrain. The moisture distribution was deep and consistent enough to support root systems that surface planting couldn't sustain. The documentation of this became a regional reference for native plant restoration in high-altitude basin environments, and Evelyn's name was on it alongside the Society's researchers, which was the kind of outcome that happens when someone who's been doing careful work in obscurity finally gets the right eyes on it. She didn't make a large event of it. She put the published document on the shelf in the back room of Juniper and Stem, next to the seed catalogs and the agricultural bank correspondence, and a small frame photograph of her mother standing in front of the shop's original window, and she went back to work. The shop by then was genuinely different from the struggling operation she'd inherited. Not unrecognizably so. It was still the same building, still the same bell above the door, still the smell of green and earth that hit you when you came in from the Wyoming cold. But the work being done inside it had depth and range that it hadn't had before, and the people coming through the door came for reasons beyond proximity and habit. A woman drove in from the valley's far end specifically for Evelyn's knowledge of native planting for erosion control. A young man apprenticed for a summer to learn propagation techniques before starting his own operation. 3 separate ranchers asked her to consult on cover crop selection for soil health, which was technically agriculture rather than floristry, but which she knew well enough by then to be genuinely useful about. The debt was gone by the 4th year. Not dramatically retired, just steadily worked down and then finished. The last payment made on a Tuesday in March that felt like any other Tuesday, except that Evelyn sat down with the ledger afterward and looked at the column of numbers and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of private satisfaction before closing it and getting back to the seed inventory. Silas noticed she was in a good mood at supper. "Ledger?" he said. "Ledger," she said. He raised his coffee cup. She raised hers. That was the extent of the celebration, which suited them both. Thomas grew into the combination of his parents that everyone had predicted and nobody had fully anticipated. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was an unusual pairing that made him effective in situations that defeated people who had only one or the other. He was 12 when he started riding up to the North Basin with Silas on the mapping surveys, and 14 when he began keeping his own records alongside his father's, his handwriting more like Evelyn's, precise and slightly right-leaning, than Silas's economical print. June was a different matter entirely. She disassembled a clock at age 6 and rebuilt it correctly at age 7, and after that, no mechanical object in the house was entirely safe. She was loud where Thomas was quiet, physical where he was contemplative, and possessed of an absolute certainty about her own opinions that Evelyn recognized as familiar, and Silas found equal parts exhausting and quietly admirable. She was also, underneath all of that, deeply kind in the way that children are kind when they've been raised in households where kindness was practiced rather than performed. She loved the cemetery the way children love places that have been explained to them honestly. It held no fear for her, only the weight of people who'd mattered, and she treated it with the straightforward respect of someone who understood that respect was what the place was for. She always brought the best yellow wildflower she could find, and she always put it at the small stone, and she did this without being asked from the time she was old enough to carry it without dropping it. One September, when she was 9, she asked Evelyn a question while they were working together in the back room of the shop, sorting the late-season seed harvest. "Mama," she said, "did the first June know she'd have us?" Evelyn looked at her daughter's face. Serious and specific, the way it got when she was thinking something through rather than performing curiosity. "No," Evelyn said. "She didn't have long enough to know anything much." "But her mother did," June said. "Papa said her mother knew what she was leaving." "That's right." June sorted seeds for a moment. "So, in a way she knew," she said, "through her mother." Evelyn looked at her, 9 years old, sorting seeds, reasoning her way through the idea that knowledge can travel forward in time through the people who carry it. "Yes," she said. "In a way she knew." June nodded, satisfied, and went back to the seeds. Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Maeve's thinking book, which still lived on the shelf in the cabin's back room where Silas had placed it after Wynne had returned it following the legal proceedings. She thought about what it contained. Not just the evidence about the water, but the record of a mind working carefully through a problem it cared about, season by season, entry by entry. The observation about the wildflowers blooming early along the creek bed. The note about the smell of the soil near the cottonwoods. The small, patient accumulation of evidence toward a truth that Maeve hadn't lived to see acted on, but had trusted would eventually matter. She thought, as she often did, that there was something worth knowing in all of it. Not a moral, exactly. Life didn't usually deliver clean morals, and the ones that got labeled as such tended to sand down the parts that made them true. More like an observation about the nature of the work that matters most. It is almost never spectacular. It is almost always incremental. It is done by people who have decided, without much fanfare, that the thing is worth doing, and who show up for it across the days and the seasons regardless of whether anyone is watching, and who leave behind them when they're gone. Soil that's different for their having been in it. Maeve had done that. Evelyn's mother had done that with a flower shop that should have failed twice and didn't, because she'd refused to treat the work as anything less than worth doing. Silas had done it for 5 years on a hill with a bunch of wildflowers, and everyone had seen grief, which it was. But it had also been the practice of love, which doesn't stop being love because the person it's directed toward can't receive it anymore. None of them had expected recognition. None of them had been doing it for recognition. They had been doing it because it was the right thing to do with the time they had, and that was a different orientation toward a life than the one that measures everything by outcome and visibility and the opinion of the street. She tried to live by that. Some days she managed it better than others. She was not a naturally patient person. She was stubborn and quick and occasionally more certain than the evidence warranted. But she had married a man whose patience was structural rather than performed, and some of it had gotten into her bones the way the cold got into them in January, gradually and then permanently. Juniper and Stem is still standing. It has new windows now, replaced after a particularly brutal hailstorm 12 years into Evelyn's ownership. The panes thicker than the originals and better sealed against the Wyoming wind. The bell above the door is the same one. The work table is the same one. The smell is the same one. On Fridays at 3, a man comes in. He is older now, with more gray in his coat and more deliberateness in his movement, and he has a slight stiffness in his left shoulder from a horse that hit him badly in a barn fire 30 years ago and never quite let the joint forget it. He buys the same thing he has always bought: wildflowers, lavender, and in the right season, a prairie rose from the North Basin, where the dry creek bed runs above the water that saved the valley. Behind the counter, the woman who ties them is not young anymore either, which is fine, because young was never what she was most. She ties them with the plain brown twine she keeps on the hook, the same as always, and she tucks the lavender in at the bottom because lavender lasts longer when it's protected by the other stems, which is a thing she learned in Denver and has practiced ever since. They walk up the hill on Fridays. The children are grown now and gone to their own lives, but they come back for the walk when they can. Thomas brought his wife last spring. June will bring whoever she decides to bring when she decides to bring them, and it will be the right person because June has her father's gift for quiet certainty about what matters, even when she's loud about everything else. At the top of the hill, there are 2 stones and the flowers from that week and whatever yellow wildflower Thomas or June has left from their last visit. The cottonwood along the fence line is old enough now to have its own history, and the valley below is the same valley it has always been, large and indifferent and specific, running all the way to the ridge where the aquifer moves beneath the rock and the wildflowers bloom first every summer, a full 2 weeks before anything else, because the water is always there underneath, always holding, regardless of the season above it. Silas stands at the stones and says what he has come to say. Evelyn stands beside him and holds his hand, and the wind comes through the cemetery the way it always does, and none of them, the living or the ones remembered, need it to be anything other than what it is.